Troublemaker on the road. Last year, Len went to visit her parents for Christmas. Snow had been falling since October, so her father had helped her switch to winter tires more than a month earlier. This made Len think she didn't need to worry too much about road conditions. Len's family had a wonderful Christmas together, but she had plans to go on a trip with a friend the following day. Their flight was scheduled for that afternoon, so she left early in the morning while it was still dark to give herself enough time to prepare for the trip and reach the airport. Unfortunately, Len hadn't paid enough attention to the snowfall the previous night. She realized that winter tires alone might not be enough, but she was determined to get home. On a dark, desolate road about 20 miles out, Len was driving cautiously, and everything seemed fine until she hit a patch of black ice. Len's car spun in one direction and then the other, completely out of control, before coming to an abrupt stop and crashing into a snowbank. Len sighed with relief, knowing she wasn't going fast enough to cause any damage to the car. However, her car was now stuck, with the wheels spinning uselessly in the thick snow. Alone in the dark, she tried to free herself by stepping out and using a flashlight and a small gardening shovel. She had stored in the trunk to dig and place mats under the tires. Her hands went numb from the cold. Suddenly, headlights appeared in the distance, and a large SUV pulled up next to Len. When they stopped next to Len, she noticed they had tire chains, the kind that could get you out of any tricky situation within minutes, especially on harsh snowy days like this. A scruffy, middle-aged man stepped out and offered to help. Len, wanting to get out of the situation, initially tried to decline, but the man insisted, dismissing her efforts as futile. He seemed aggressive and began glaring at her condescendingly, belittling Len for trying to handle things herself, saying she was too small and too weak to deal with anything on her own, and that she wasn't any good to anyone. He opened the trunk of his SUV, pulled out a long chain, looped it around a mounting point under her car's front bumper, and made her hold it while he retrieved something to secure it. As Len held the chain, the man's behavior became increasingly troubling. He kept asserting control over the situation, and his actions grew more erratic. As a foreboding feeling set in, while she began attaching the lock to the chain, Len cautiously noticed the man's hand moving behind his back as if he was hiding something. Len glanced over her shoulder and saw the man swinging something in the air. In an instant, she realized he was about to strike her with a hammer. Len barely dodged the blow and broke free from his grasp. He sneered menacingly, saying,
"You know, out here, no one will hear you scream."
Len yanked the chain from under the car and whipped it across his face as he tried to strike her again, stunning him just long enough for her to escape. He screamed in pain as Len ran around to the passenger seat, jumped in, and locked the door just moments before he reached the window and started pounding on the glass. Len crawled into the driver's seat, praying she wouldn't get stuck. She could almost hear her father's voice, reminding her not to accelerate too quickly. So, against her panicked instincts, she slowly pressed the gas pedal. He grabbed the hammer he had intended to use to harm her, leisurely approached the car, and smashed Len's window, but she didn't stop. She hesitated, slowly increasing the throttle to avoid spinning the stuck tires. Her car still wasn't moving, and she tried to focus on being cautious rather than taking unnecessary risks. But he didn't hesitate. Losing control and growing angrier with each swing, his blows became stronger, and eventually, the glass shattered. He reached in and grabbed Len's neck. She was on the verge of losing consciousness, but a surge of willpower arose within her. She couldn't let it end like this. She tried again, slowly pressing the gas, and finally, her car started to move. His arm got caught on the jagged remnants of the glass, and in pain, he finally let her go. When Len contacted the police, she reported the man's erratic behavior and detailed description. A few days later, they informed her that a suspect matching her description had been apprehended. He was a known offender who targeted stranded drivers. Len was called in to identify him. In the courtroom, he tried to intimidate her with a cold glare, but she ensured he was convicted. Despite her fear, trusting her instincts and acting decisively not only saved her, but also prevented others from becoming victims of his sinister plans. Uber drivers, weird night. I had been driving Uber for about a year and had never really encountered any trouble, except for once when a drunk man tried to punch out my backseat window. But the only reason I quit this job has to do with something I had never encountered, and to this day, I still remember it vividly. Around midnight, I received a request to pick up someone named Pamela at an address that seemed a bit off the usual route. I drove to the address. The area was deserted, and there were no signs of anyone being around. Suddenly, the back door opened, and I jumped in surprise. Turning around, I saw an elderly woman, probably in her 80s. At this late hour, it was a bit odd, but I had seen older passengers before, though not very often. She silently struggled to get into the back seat, and I noticed her hollow, empty eyes as if she had just woken up from a coma and couldn't make sense of what was happening around her. "How's your night, Pamela?" I asked cheerfully and friendly, but she didn't respond. A beep from my phone. A destination popped up. It was quite nearby, but I had never heard of it before, so I felt a little uneasy. I drove, trying to push that strange feeling out of my mind. The city blurred by in a haze, but then a voice, low and raspy, finally spoke. "Why aren't you taking me to that address?" she said to me. I told her I was taking her there, and it was still quite a distance. I replied, trying to stay polite, but the uneasy feeling, something wasn't right, kept growing. Then she started yelling at me, demanding I stop the car. It felt a bit rude, but what I needed to do now was stay polite. I wanted her out of my car, so I happily complied and stopped. I complied, stopping the car at a quiet corner just a few blocks away. I tilted my head to glance over my shoulder to wish her good luck, as it was part of my daily routine. But when I turned back, Pamela was right in front of my face, just millimeters away, hovering between the two front seats. I froze. Her eyes were white, sunken deep into her face. Her mouth was wide open, gasping for air, as if struggling and laboring to breathe. I stammered, "Pamela, are you okay?" Then her hand touched my shoulder. It was cold as ice, seeping into my skin and bones. Her pupils rolled back into her head, leaving her eyes completely white. My mind couldn't comprehend anything, and I began to fear for my own life. Before I could say anything, she leaned close to my ear and whispered in a chilling voice, "Go to the stairs tonight." I looked at her, confused. Pamela didn't say anything else, then climbed out of the car. I watched her shuffle toward a dilapidated building and disappear inside. I whispered to myself, not knowing what the hell had just happened. That night, I turned off the app and drove back to my apartment. When I arrived at the building, I sat in my car for about 10 to 15 minutes, trying to make sense of the woman's words. Eventually, I calmed down and went inside the apartment. I had just moved into this place because the rent was cheap, and it was an old building. People always complained about the maintenance and facilities. It really needed repairs, but the landlord never cared. I lived on the 6th floor. I went to the elevator and pressed the button, watching the numbers slowly go down. There was no one else in the lobby, but I couldn't shake the chill running down my spine. The numbers on the screen flickered. Suddenly, I heard a hoarse whisper, cold and close to my ear, "Close it." I jumped, looking around, but there was no one there. Pamela, is she following me? Sweat beaded on my forehead, and I decided I couldn't wait any longer. I sprinted toward the stairs, almost crawling on all fours as I climbed. The darkness below seemed to be chasing me. When I reached my apartment, I slammed the door shut and sat on the floor. Suddenly, I heard a loud crash. It sounded like something had collapsed to the ground, and the fire alarm went off, with people screaming. I opened the door and saw other tenants looking down the hallway, talking in panic. The elevator, it malfunctioned and crashed. The landlord was handcuffed and led away, charged with endangering tenants by neglecting maintenance. Other residents were shouting at him, angry at his irresponsibility. I stood still in disbelief that I was alive. As the police took the landlord away, I overheard two tenants talking, saying they remembered him once saying he had fixed it, but Mrs. Miller still died, crushed. They couldn't even imagine how terrified she must have felt when the elevator fell. "Who are you talking about?" I asked. One person answered, "That's Pamela Miller, the woman who lived in your apartment before you. She died in that very elevator, but somehow, the landlord got away with it. I still visit her grave sometimes. God bless her." My head spun as I tried to understand. I had just driven a woman named Pamela. I realized that the woman I had met wasn't just a strange passenger. I had encountered something beyond my understanding. Maybe she was trying to warn me so I wouldn't meet the same tragic fate as hers. The Uber driver's nightmare trip. The Uber nightmare, it was just another night on the job. Not that I enjoyed these late shifts, but my rent was due in a week, and I'd already spent all my money on new tires and an oil change. I'd been driving every night. I really hated driving at night. The fog, the isolation, it always gave me chills. I had just dropped off a drunk couple from a bar when my phone buzzed, signaling the next ride. As I drove to pick up my next passenger, I noticed it was the exact spot where I had picked up the couple just half an hour earlier. I figured it was just a strange coincidence. I stopped at the pickup location but didn't see anyone. The fog had thickened, as if swallowing the entire street. I honked the horn and glanced around to see if anyone was coming, but there was no one. I quickly checked my phone to confirm the pickup spot on the app. Just as I was about to double-check the app, my back door suddenly opened, and my heart nearly jumped out of my chest. I let out a nervous laugh, even feeling a little embarrassed. It was a man. He didn't say a word as he got in and sat down, clutching a brown paper bag tightly. There was something unsettling about the way he held that bag. After a moment, he told me he knew the couple I had just dropped off. Then, he asked me to take him to the same location where I'd dropped them off earlier. I keyed in the address and started driving. A few miles down the road, my phone buzzed, and I nearly jumped. I got a notification from Uber that someone else wanted to be picked up along the way. It was odd, considering it was past 3 in the morning. I arrived at the new pickup location, and she was standing beneath a streetlight, making her easy to spot. She ran toward the passenger seat, and instinctively, I unlocked the door for her to sit up front. With the man in the back seat, I didn't want to take any chances. I turned away and focused on driving. I glanced at her again. There was something about the way she looked at the man in the back seat, as if they shared a connection, but weren't saying it out loud. We drove in silence. I checked the map. All 3 of them were headed to the same address where I'd dropped off the couple earlier. My mind started racing. What's going on? Why is she going there too? Then I curiously asked, "So, do you all know each other?" She smiled, turned to me, and nodded. "Yes," she said with absolute confidence. When we arrived at the address, I noticed all the lights were off. They began walking toward the house, and before leaving, The woman turned back and said, "Just wait here for a minute. We'll be right back." Both disappeared into the darkness. I stared ahead and sat there for a few minutes, wondering for a moment, should I just leave? Suddenly, there was a loud bang on my car window. She yelled, "Please, hurry, hurry. My friend needs help. We need your help to get her to the hospital." I tried to shake off the fear in my mind and got out of the car to follow her. When we reached the door, the man slammed it shut behind me. He shoved me to the ground, and I saw the knife in his hand. The woman's voice changed, her calm demeanor replaced by a cruel laugh. She slowly turned to me and told me to run while laughing maniacally. I crawled as quickly as I could to the dining room, and I couldn't believe my eyes, the couple I had dropped off an hour ago. But they were no longer alive. The man was now behind me. He was so close. I ran as fast as I could. Luckily, he slipped, giving me just enough time to sprint up the stairs. I wedged myself into a closet, trying to suppress my sobs. I wasn't sure how long I could stay hidden. Then I suddenly realized there was a figure, a woman, standing in front of the closet. Perhaps the blood trail on the floor had given me away. I hesitated, but saw she was alone outside. I took a chance, shoved the door open, and knocked her to the ground. I hurried to the window without hesitation. I smashed the glass, breaking it, and climbed out. Pain shot through my arm, but I ignored it. I couldn't go back. I just ran, got into my car, and drove straight to the police station. My efforts paid off. The next morning, investigators uncovered the full extent of the killer's crimes. Dozens of drivers had been lured to their deaths in the same way I had been. They had used ride-sharing services as a cover, abducting innocent victims one by one, all for their dark purposes. This ruthless duo had evaded capture many times, but not this time. They were arrested. I felt incredibly lucky because, as far as I knew, most people didn't survive. The nightmare, it seemed, had finally ended. Seeking the truth. The city never sleeps, and Kevin does his best to make a living as a night shift taxi driver. He is a hard-working and kind man. One foggy night, as Kevin followed his usual route, he turned a corner onto a quiet, nearly deserted street and saw her. A woman stood alone under the flickering glow of a street lamp. She was dressed in black, her long hair hanging loose, and her pale hand raised to hail his taxi. Something about her seemed off, but Kevin's job wasn't to ask questions, it was to drive. The woman climbed into the back seat without a word, handing him a piece of paper with a hastily scrawled address. The address was unfamiliar to him and seemed unsettling. As they drove through increasingly deserted streets, Kevin tried to make conversation, but she remained coldly silent. When they finally arrived, a decaying, abandoned house on the edge of a forest loomed in the darkness. Kevin stopped the car, unease building as he turned to tell her they had arrived and mentioned the fare. Then Kevin turned around to find the back seat empty. The door was shut, and the woman was gone, as though she had never been there. No money, no sound, no trace. Confusion mixed with a hint of anger as he stared into the darkness. He chalked it up to a strange, unlucky night and drove away, determined to forget it. A few days later, Kevin was driving through the city again. Once more, he saw a woman standing by the roadside. She looked eerily familiar. The dress, the posture, the loose hair. Was it the same woman? Kevin wasn't sure. He hadn't paid close attention to her face last time. But this time, she seemed different. She was clutching her stomach as if injured or ill. Her face was pale and strained, as though in great pain. She looked like she was struggling to stay upright. Kevin hesitated, memories of the previous encounter surfacing, but he couldn't ignore her distress and slowly pulled over. He parked by the curb and rolled down the window.
Are you okay?
She didn't answer, her lips trembling, but after a moment, she slowly looked up. The woman's gaze met his briefly, her wide, haunting eyes struggling to utter a single whispered word.
Help!
Kevin wasn't the type to ignore someone in need. He told her to get in and said he would take her where she needed to go. She quietly got into the car, her breathing shallow and labored, but she said nothing more. Her presence was icy. She handed him a piece of paper. It was an address near the edge of the forest, close to the previous location. An eerie coincidence. This time, the destination was a hospital instead of an old house. The ride was bizarre. Occasionally, he glanced at her, her hand pressed tightly against her stomach, but she remained utterly still. Her breathing was nearly inaudible, like the distant whisper of the wind, hollow and empty. After what felt like an eternity, Kevin stopped the car, but a cold breeze brushed his ear, sending chills down his spine.
Help me!
A cold draft swept into the car, making him shiver. When Kevin turned around, the woman was gone. The rear door was wide open, and the seat she had occupied was empty.
What the hell is happening?
The woman's sudden disappearance left him frozen in place, unsure of what to do. His hands trembled as he locked the doors, quickly started the engine, and drove away as fast as he could. Back at home, Kevin couldn't shake the encounter. Questions gnawed at him. Who was that woman? How did she disappear? And why did she lead him there? Something strange was going on. After days of pondering, Kevin couldn't shake the fear tormenting him. He returned to the hospital, hoping to find answers. He asked the staff about the woman he had seen, but no one seemed to know anything about her. But after all that, he found no leads. In his moment of despair, he suddenly saw the shadow of the woman he had seen before. She was standing at the end of the hospital corridor, and the place felt eerily empty, save for the two of them. Unable to explain why, he followed her to a locker belonging to a man. The name on the locker read Dr. Don. He had no idea what this meant. Was there a connection between her and this man? Moments later, Kevin was still standing in the hallway, but she was gone. Instead, the usual sounds of hospital staff working, patients moving, and the general hum of life returned. Everything seemed normal again. As Kevin contemplated leaving, unsure of who this Dr. Don was, a nurse's voice called out from behind him, "Dr. Don." He froze and turned to see a tall, slender doctor with a beard and glasses that gave him an air of intellect. Kevin noticed that the people around seemed to hold him in high regard. Kevin questioned himself. Was there anything suspicious about a man like that? He certainly didn't seem the type. Still, Kevin decided to sit and observe. Dr. Don stepped out of his office and headed toward the exit. Kevin quietly followed until the doctor turned around to look at him. The doctor didn't appear worried at all and spoke in a calm, composed voice.
Hello, can I help you with something?
Kevin, feeling flustered, lied and said he was visiting his girlfriend here. Kevin deflected by glancing at his name tag.
Dr. Don, this is my first time seeing you. You seem well liked.
The doctor smiled politely and excused himself, but Kevin couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Kevin returned to the corridor, beginning to feel ridiculous and questioning if he was taking things too far. Then, the woman appeared again at the end of the hallway. A whisper close to his ear said,
Help me, please.
Kevin froze, but the encounter reinforced his resolve. Maybe it was time to follow his instincts. Dr. Don's silhouette was retreating. Kevin decided to follow him cautiously, and, strangely, Dr. Don was heading toward the very house the woman had led him to before. The old, decaying, and completely isolated house. The windows of the house were nearly boarded up. After a while, Dr. Don left the house through the front door, locking it behind him. Kevin pressed himself against a pile of wood nearby to avoid being seen. Once Don was out of sight. Kevin crept to the back of the house and, to his surprise, found the door unlocked. Opening it cautiously, Kevin stepped inside. Inside was a mess of decay and foul odors. Rubber gloves, small glass jars, and scraps of fabric were scattered across the floor, along with dark, dried stains. Kevin felt a chill run down his spine as he heard sounds coming from a room not far away. The door was shut tight and locked. Breaking it open would cause a loud noise and be extremely risky. Suddenly, she appeared again, standing next to a cabinet. Her eyes locked onto Kevin before shifting toward the cabinet. It revealed a key hidden behind the shelf. In an instant, she vanished once more, perhaps guiding Kevin. Just as Kevin reached for the key, he heard footsteps approaching. Panicked, he hid in a small cabinet, barely fitting inside before Don returned. Through the crack of the cabinet door, Kevin saw him open the room and drag out a heavy bag. The doctor retrieved a syringe and a small glass vial, proceeding to do something suspicious. A creak inadvertently escaped from the cabinet where Kevin was hiding. Don put his tools down and approached the cabinet. Kevin held his breath, preparing for the worst. As Don got closer, Kevin realized he had no escape. Seizing the moment, he burst out, pushing the doctor to the ground before dashing into the forest behind the house. Don chased after Kevin. At the edge of the forest, Kevin managed to call the police. As they ran deeper into the woods, Kevin's years of experience in the wilderness began to pay off. His eyes caught a marked tree stump. He remembered traps he had learned about as a child, the kind hunters used for animals. It was a net trap leading to a concealed pit. Kevin stopped, carefully observing and calculating. Don approached with a scalpel in hand.
You know too much. This will be quick, he sneered.
As he neared the trap, Kevin deliberately moved slowly, calmly observing. Suddenly, Kevin jumped aside. Don lunged forward, oblivious to the trap. Bam! A loud snap echoed as he fell into the concealed pit, screaming in pain. Shortly after, the police arrived and uncovered the horrifying events that had taken place in the house. Don's past was plagued by an abusive father. He had built a facade of respectability, but was, in reality, a monster. He would overdose his patients with drugs and record their suffering while laughing maniacally. Many had met unjust ends at the hands of this madman. The woman Kevin had seen was found deceased at the scene. She had sought help, likely for her sister, who had also been held captive in the same house. They had both uncovered Don's depravity. Kevin was haunted by everything he had experienced. He wondered how many others like her had wandered into the dark corners of the world, waiting for someone to help before it was too late. In the end, though, Don finally faced justice. The price of the silent one. I glanced at the clock. It was past midnight. I thought it was time to head home. I left the lab late one evening after a long day of experiments. The night was dark, the streets deserted, and the cold air biting at anyone daring to venture out. The road was empty, and the only sound was the distant howl of the wind. As I drove, I suddenly noticed something moving by the roadside. A figure, a girl, walking alone in the desolation. She seemed disoriented, wearing a red coat, her head bowed, and her posture rigid, standing out under the dim light. Something about her felt off, so I slowed my car and came to a stop. I asked her if she was okay. "Do you need a ride?" The girl didn't reply. She kept walking, her steps slow. as if she didn't even notice my presence. Finally, the girl stopped, and she slowly turned around. She had a beautiful face, but her skin was deathly pale, with an expression of anguish, as if she had forgotten how to smile forever. She asked for a ride and said she was on her way home. I politely hesitated at first, but then I agreed to give her a ride. I drove along the dark road as the girl sat silently in the back, staring out of the window. As I drove through the town, approaching an old cemetery, the girl's behavior suddenly shifted. She began to grow increasingly agitated. Suddenly, she started clawing at the car window with her nails, screaming hysterically as if she were desperate to escape. She shouted, "Let me out! Let me out!" Panicked and unsure what was happening, I scrambled to unlock the door. She flung the car door open and bolted towards the cemetery. Her speed was unnatural, almost too fast, disappearing into the night. I got out of the car, calling after her, but she was gone, leaving me standing alone in the eerie silence of the darkness. Confused, I drove away, chalking the incident up as nothing more than a strange encounter. A few nights later, I drove home along the same route, but every night, something strange and puzzling happened. I encountered her again, asking for a ride. Each time as we neared the cemetery, she would scream, louder than before, and run into the darkness. It was like a looped tape, ending in terror every single time. My curiosity grew, and I began to wonder if I was witnessing something from another world. After 4 consecutive nights of experiencing the same bizarre encounter, I couldn't ignore her strange, repetitive behavior anymore. I was haunted by thoughts of what might be happening at the cemetery, and the image of her running remained etched in my mind. The next day, I decided to visit the cemetery to investigate. I began noticing the old, weathered gravestones, a strange sensation settling over me as I surveyed the area. After some searching, I stumbled upon a gravestone bearing the name Lydia Ward. What shocked me even more was the image on the grave. It was the girl who had asked for a ride. I was frozen in disbelief. Her date of death was engraved as 7 years ago. A chill ran down my spine as I read the words "killed" in a ritual. My mind began to spiral as the name and face felt eerily familiar. I couldn't shake the memory of another girl named Lydia. She had been killed in a satanic ritual. I realized that I might have been the one who witnessed her death all those years ago. When I was a student, I had taken part in a challenge to prove that demons weren't real and thought I was the only one at the cemetery. But suddenly, I was startled by the sound of a girl screaming. I followed the sound and discovered 3 men torturing a girl. I hid behind a bush to avoid being seen and watched as the men carried out what appeared to be some kind of satanic ritual. When the ritual ended, I thought it was over, or perhaps just a bizarre performance. Then, I saw the men sacrifice the girl, one of them holding a knife, attempting to take her life. I couldn't think of anything. I was terrified and quietly ran away. I acted like a coward, staying silent to avoid getting myself into trouble. My thoughts are now clouded by guilt and confusion. I was one of the last people to see Lydia alive. I feel responsible for not doing more, for not intervening when I saw her that day. I spent the next few days researching Lydia's death. I dug through old police records, spoke to former classmates, and visited the university archives. I discovered that Lydia's death was a tragic and mysterious event. Some students at the school had joined a cult-like group that conducted rituals in the cemetery, and Lydia was their victim. Although the police investigated, no one was convicted. My guilt grew as I realized that I had been there that day but was too afraid to intervene. Perhaps that's why her spirit has come to me. As I dug deeper into everything, I began experiencing strange occurrences. I constantly heard whispers in my home, and at night, Lydia appeared every night, standing at the foot of my bed with her sunken, sorrowful eyes. her mouth whispering softly. My room always felt cold, the air thick and heavy, as if her grief was pressing down on me. I began to wonder if Lydia's spirit was trying to tell me something. Perhaps her murder was tied to a larger conspiracy, and only I could uncover the truth. I returned to the cemetery. I felt her presence guiding me, leading me to a hidden spot behind an old mausoleum. I discovered numerous symbols etched onto the old stone walls and trees surrounding the cemetery. They resembled symbols used in ancient satanic rituals. My hands trembled as I took photos. The cult had used this place. Lydia had died here, sacrificed to summon whatever they worshipped. Piecing together everything I knew, I realized that Lydia's death was only part of a larger ritual that was taking place. The cult had used the lives of innocent people to summon dark forces, and Lydia was the final sacrifice. Overwhelmed by the truth, I knew I couldn't let this mystery remain hidden and unanswered any longer. I finally gathered enough evidence, photos, documents, symbols, to bring to the police and share what I had hidden and discovered. I knew that my actions were the only way to free her soul. The police finally launched a comprehensive investigation into the cult's activities, arresting several former students and members who had participated in the rituals. In the end, justice was served for Lydia, and her soul could finally rest after 7 years of torment. In the final moments, I visited Lydia's grave once more. This time, as I stood before her grave, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. By uncovering the truth, I had redeemed myself, and now I could let go of the guilt that had haunted me for so long. As Rick turned to leave, he glanced back and saw a figure standing in the distance, Lydia's red coat billowing in the wind. He smiled softly, knowing she was no longer trapped, but finally free. Escape from the terrifying truck. On a Sunday afternoon, Mac and I decided to go hiking in some hills, just an hour's drive from the city. The hill we chose today had a fairly simple trail, not too steep, and when we reached the top, everything felt peaceful, just like any other time we had gone hiking. After a short rest, we started heading down, but just 10 minutes later, Mac began complaining about the rough path. He wanted to take a different trail down. I hesitated but eventually agreed. We hadn't seen another soul since we started our descent. Then we heard the sound of an engine. A rusty, heavy red truck was coming toward us. The man driving rolled down his window and flashed a smile that seemed friendly enough, but something felt off. He offered us a ride. Mac, always trusting, thought the guy seemed nice enough. I wasn't so sure. Mac begged and convinced me to get in, saying it was only a 10-minute drive. I was cautious, but I got in with him. Inside, the truck was shabby but clean. As we settled in, I instinctively started scanning my surroundings. My eyes were drawn to the floor, where I saw a coil of rope behind the driver's seat. Unease began to creep in. 10 minutes passed. We were no closer to the main road, and the woods around us grew denser. I asked the man how much longer it would take. He said we were just taking a different route and that we'd have to stop somewhere to pick up his stuff. We stopped in front of a small cabin, hidden deep in the woods. There was an old tree stump out front, with a large axe stuck in it as if he had been chopping wood. I glanced at Mac, but he seemed excited and trusting of the man. The man turned off the engine and got out of the truck. He said,
"Stay here. I'll be right back."
As soon as he was out of sight, panic started to rise within me. I turned to Mac, pleading with him to leave, not to get out, but he didn't see the danger I saw. That's when I turned back to the truck and saw it. Half hidden under the driver's seat was an axe. Dark stains covered the blade stains that could only be blood. I quickly told Mac to look. He froze, his face turning pale as he realized the danger we were in. Without another word, we bolted into the forest, fleeing the imminent threat. We crashed through the thick underbrush, not caring where we were headed as long as it was away from that cabin, trying to stay on a trail to avoid getting lost. Finally, the trees began to thin, and I could see the wooden fence surrounding the parking lot. A wave of relief washed over me. But then I saw it. The man's truck was parked on the other side of the lot, engine off, lying in wait like a predator ready to pounce. Mac wanted to run to our car, but I held him back. The parking lot was too wide, too exposed for us to make a safe escape. We hid behind a large tree, cloaked in the darkness. Time seemed to stretch, each second feeling like an eternity. As night fell, I heard a sound. The truck's door creaked open. The man climbed out, glancing around the forest once more. Mac made a mistake. He stepped on a branch, causing a snap. The man noticed and lingered for a moment, then started walking toward a nearby tree. We covered our mouths, hearts pounding, afraid to breathe or move as he came dangerously close to where we were hiding. Just then, a forest ranger approached the truck. The man seemed startled or afraid of being caught, so he quickly returned to his truck and drove away. As soon as he was gone, we bolted to our car, not stopping until we were inside with the doors locked. We sped out of there as fast as we could. That night, we drove in silence. The danger was behind us, but the fear lingered. As we finally returned to safety, I couldn't help but think about what might have happened if we had stayed in that truck any longer. When we got back, we reported the incident to the forest rangers so they could investigate and warn other hikers to be more cautious. The final trip. Christy was an Uber driver. She enjoyed the flexibility it offered her, but she was also aware of the risks. Many people warned her that Uber might not be a safe job for a woman. She had never been scared and didn't believe such situations were real. But when you're the mother of 3 kids and struggling to give them a good life, you take risks. One night, Christy experienced a harrowing situation that proved all the warnings she had received were true. That night, at 10:30 p.m., Christy accepted a ride request from a quiet suburban neighborhood. The passenger was a man named Calvin. When Christy arrived, she saw him wearing a hoodie, avoiding eye contact. Something about his demeanor made her uneasy, but she reminded herself to stay calm and professional. That was her first big mistake. Calvin got into the car with hardly any reaction, pulling his hood down to hide his face. Many passengers did this when uncomfortable with her filming the trip, but it was also something that made her feel safer. Calvin said nothing and stared out the window, making Christy feel uneasy. She tried not to dwell on it and focused on the road, but her discomfort grew. Just minutes away from the destination, the increasingly deserted road made her fear. Her worst nightmare was coming true. Suddenly, Calvin leaned forward and pressed something hard and cold against her neck. It was a gun. He growled, "Turn left at the next exit, and don't ask any questions." She trembled, begging him not to hurt her because she had kids at home who depended on her. But he pressed the gun harder against her. The car stopped in an isolated clearing. Calvin ordered Christy out. He turned off her phone and took the car keys. Desperation filled her as her mind raced to find a way to escape. They moved deeper into the woods. Calvin shoved her forward, the gun still pressed against her back. Reaching a clearing, he rummaged through her belongings for anything of value. He found a small amount of cash, but grumbled that it wasn't enough before continuing to search. Christy realized this was her moment to act. She pulled a can of pepper spray from her pocket and quickly sprayed it into his face. He screamed in pain, and Christy seized the opportunity to escape, running as fast as she could. Panic fueled her speed. The place was pitch dark, and Christy ran blindly, each step bringing her closer to either freedom or death. Branches scratched and cut her skin as she ran, but none of that mattered now. She just wanted to survive. Ahead, Christy spotted a light in the distance, a potential way out of the forest. As she ran, she could hear Calvin's footsteps getting closer, and her hope of escape began to fade. Another mistake happened. Christy, distracted by looking back at him chasing her, tripped over a hidden rock and fell to the ground. Pain shot through her ankle. As she tried to get up, he grabbed her by the hair and yanked it. She begged, "Please don't kill me. I gave you everything I had." In response, he threw her against a nearby tree. In pain and despair, she obeyed him, kneeling and begging for her life. Christy was waiting for something to happen, for someone to save her, but perhaps this was her chance to save herself. While he was catching his breath from running and rubbing his eyes in pain, Christy quietly reached behind her and grabbed a rock. Without thinking much, she struck him on the head with the rock. Blood streamed down his face as he staggered. Despite her twisted ankle, she ran toward the light she had seen earlier. A narrow stream, quietly flowing through the forest, caused her to pause for a moment. Thinking of her children, she waded through the stream, knowing the sound of the water would mask her footsteps and hide her movements. The pain in her ankle was nothing compared to the horror of what would happen if Calvin caught her. She crawled through the bushes, her body aching, but her will to survive stronger than ever. When she reached the road, her body was exhausted, but she could hear the faint sound of an approaching car. Christy staggered toward the roadside, frantically waving her arms, barely able to speak. "Please, I need help. He's chasing me. Please." A woman immediately stopped her car and ran to Christy, calling the police. And that was when Christy's vision blurred as she collapsed from exhaustion. Christy, now safe, was able to assist the authorities in building a case against him, leading to his arrest and prosecution. Despite her injuries, Christy found peace and gratitude in knowing she had survived. She could see her children again. She had conquered her fear and emerged stronger. Escape from the terrifying snowstorm night. This happened a few New Year's Eves ago. I was driving to my parents' house to celebrate the new year with them. A simple trip. I was used to long drives. Snow started falling about an hour into the drive. Light at first, but it kept coming until I found myself in the middle of a snowstorm. The highway grew slippery, and visibility dropped to near zero. My car, a small one, wasn't built for driving in the snow. The tires slid even on the smallest incline, and I realized I needed to stop. I texted my parents about my situation to reassure them, but honestly, I wasn't so sure myself. An hour passed, and the snow only got worse. I began worrying about running out of gas or draining the battery by keeping the heater on too long. I kept the engine running, hoping the storm would ease. The wind howled outside. I began to feel the weight of isolation when I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw headlights cutting through the storm behind me. I felt an overwhelming relief as a snowplow stopped beside me. Finally, someone had come to help. The truck slowed and stopped beside me. It was the driver, a man leaning out the window. He was an older man, perhaps in his late 50s, wearing a thick coat and a black knit cap pulled down over his ears. I expected him to say something, but he just stared at me for an uncomfortably long moment. His voice was hoarse, like someone who had smoked for years.
"Are you okay?"
He asked. I told him I didn't think my car could handle the conditions, and he said to get in, that he'd take me somewhere safe. He got out of the truck. I hesitated. I didn't know this man, and he seemed a little strange, but he appeared sincere. The storm was relentless, and staying wasn't an option. "All right," I replied, then asked if he could take me to my destination. He didn't answer right away. his eyes darting quickly behind my car, as if looking for something. Then, without a word, he told me to get in. The warmth inside the snowplow was a relief compared to the biting cold outside. We didn't talk much during the ride, but as the minutes passed, I began to sense something strange. As I glanced out the window, I realized we weren't heading toward my parents' house. The surroundings looked unfamiliar. A lingering unease crept in. I asked, trying to sound casual, "Are we going the right way?" The driver didn't look at me and said it was a shortcut. At least GPS showed we were going the right way, so I figured I was just being paranoid. I glanced around the truck. Everything was a mess. Empty whiskey bottles and torn maps stuffed into the side compartments. My eyes stopped at something wedged between the seats, a knife, half hidden under the chair. Suddenly, I saw a small house ahead, the only house I'd seen after a long stretch of emptiness. I knew I had to act before something bad happened. A sense of foreboding washed over me. I waited until we got closer, took a deep breath, grabbed the door handle, and kicked the door open as hard as I could. I flung the door wide and ran into the snowstorm. The blizzard made visibility almost zero. The thick snow slowed my steps, but I pressed on toward the faint light of the wooden house. Behind me, I could hear him shouting, but I didn't stop. The snowplow driver didn't give up. He rummaged through the glove compartment and pulled out a handgun, yelling,
"Get back here! You're not going anywhere!"
As I neared the house's door, he fired the gun. I thought I'd used up all my luck when the bullet grazed my shoulder, leaving a painful wound. Staggering, I banged on the wooden door, shouting for help. A man appeared with a shotgun in hand. Before I could explain, he seemed to understand and quickly pulled me inside, slamming the door shut. He stayed outside, shouting, his eyes wild and unrelenting. He fired the gun again, the bullet shattering a large piece of the window. The hunter, with no other choice, opened the door and charged outside with the shotgun. The two of them wrestled in the blizzard, the gun falling from their hands. I couldn't just stand there. Before he could act, I picked up the shotgun and aimed it straight at him. As he hesitated, the hunter took the opportunity to tackle him to the snow-covered ground and tied him up with a rope. A short while later, the police arrived, and he was arrested. I was so grateful to the hunter for saving me, and relieved I had made the right decision to jump out of that truck. The Nightmare Delivery Trip. Ryan, a hard-working pizza delivery driver, had been working night shifts for 2 years. His job usually involved driving, delivering, and collecting payments. Most nights went smoothly, but one fateful night changed everything. Near midnight, Ryan received the final delivery order of his shift. The address was on the outskirts of town, near the industrial area, a place he had never delivered to before. The streets were eerily deserted, with most streetlights flickering or completely off. The place always gave him a sense of isolation, but Ryan assumed it was just another late-night delivery. He saw a small, rundown house that didn't scream danger. Yet, something felt off about the place. At the end of the driveway stood a tall man wearing a gray coat and jeans. He didn't move. He just stood there, staring at Ryan's car with an unsettling smile. Ryan hesitated but regained his composure, grabbed the pizza, and approached the man.
Hey, here's your pizza.
Ryan said, naming the price, but the man didn't rush to pay. Instead, the man slowly pulled out a handful of coins. He began counting them one by one, placing each coin into his other hand, as if performing some ritual. The air grew colder with each passing second. My fingers began to freeze around the pizza box. The man's grin widened as he said, "You drive too fast, Ryan." Ryan froze. How did he know his name? Panic surged through him.
What?
Ryan stammered.
I don't know you. I don't think we've met before.
Then Ryan quickly backed away. He hurried back to his car, started the engine, and drove off. But when he glanced in the rearview mirror, he saw the man still standing there, holding the pizza and staring at him. But that wasn't the last time. A week later, near the end of his shift, Ryan's manager assigned him one final pizza delivery for the night, another strange order. The address was a house on the outskirts of town, near where he had gone before. The house he arrived at looked abandoned, with boarded-up windows and peeling paint. A note was taped to the door, delivered to the basement. A chill ran down Ryan's spine. Delivering to a basement was unusual. Reluctantly, needing to finish the job, he decided to follow the instructions. As he approached the basement door, he hesitated. A loud creak sounded as he opened it, revealing a narrow, chilly staircase leading down. Something felt off.
Hello?
Ryan called, his voice trembling, but there was no response. At the bottom, the basement stretched into darkness, with several doors lining the walls. One door was slightly ajar, with a faint light spilling out. The small room was dimly lit by a single lamp. In the center of the room was a figure of a man, entirely sculpted out of wax. It was almost perfectly life-sized, like a real person. At first, Ryan thought it was some kind of artwork. The figure slumped in a chair, its wax face eerie and lifelike, with deep eyes and a twisted, unsettling smile. The extraordinary detail made him shiver, wrinkles on the skin, hairs embedded perfectly in the wax. But there was something unsettling, a thin layer of moisture on the wax, making it seem as though it was sweating. Ryan placed the pizza box on the table, instinct urging him to leave. But something about the figure drew him closer. As he got closer, he noticed small cracks running along the wax skin. And then he saw it. Beneath one of the cracks was something red, a dark, congealed liquid. He didn't want to think it, but it might have been blood. Then, as he put his hand near the nose, he felt a faint breath. He leaned closer, and that's when he noticed the chest. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but the chest was rising and falling ever so slightly. Ryan turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind him. Ryan spun around to see a man stepping out from the corner of the room, tall, gaunt. It was him, the man Ryan had met earlier. He wore a dark apron, stained with streaks of wax and blood. In his hand, he held a brush dripping with molten wax. Ryan held his breath as he realized what the man intended. Just as he thought, the figure in the chair wasn't a sculpture but a person, encased in wax, still alive. The man stepped closer, holding the brush like a weapon. "You shouldn't have come here, but maybe you'll make a fine addition." Ryan dashed for the door, but the man was quicker, grabbing his arm. His grip was cold and sticky, and Ryan could feel the wax coating his skin.
Help me.
Ryan turned to see the wax man's lips moving, his eyes darting desperately. It was the first sign of life he had shown. Ryan broke free from the man's grip, grabbed the desk lamp, and smashed it into the man's face. The bulb shattered, plunging the room into darkness. Ryan scrambled for the door, fumbling for the handle. Behind him, the man screamed in pain, and the buzzing in the air turned into a high-pitched shriek. Ryan bolted into the hallway, slamming the door behind him. When he finally made it home, he scrubbed at his skin, desperate to remove the faint traces of wax clinging to his arms. But no matter how hard he scrubbed, he couldn't shake the feeling it was still there. Ryan quit his job the next day and reported the incident to the police. He tried to forget what he had seen, but every night he was haunted by the image of the wax man's eyes. The dark truck. Jack Carson, a rough-mannered, long-haul truck driver known for taking jobs no one else wanted, embarked on a long journey down an infamous, desolate road. His truck was tightly sealed, labeled only as medical supplies. The highway stretched endlessly, eerily quiet, with no signs of life except for the occasional rustling of dead trees in the wind. It was the kind of road you only took if you absolutely had to. Jack stopped at a solitary, dilapidated rest area. He stepped out for a smoke, the silence pressing on him like a physical weight. The wind carried faint, eerie whispers. Jack couldn't tell where they came from, but as he looked around, there was no one in sight. As he leaned against the truck, breathing in the air, a soft yet menacing voice whispered in his ear.
You will die, as I did.
Startled, he turned around, dropping his cigarette, but there was no one there. Just a strange mist swirling outside the window. Shaken, Jack climbed back into the truck and slammed the door shut. He had never experienced anything that felt so real. As soon as he started the engine, the radio turned on with an old, haunting tune. He brushed it off, thinking it was a malfunction. His hands trembled as he turned the knob to silence it, but the static continued, almost as if mocking him. Driving down the dark stretch of road, those words kept echoing in his mind.
You will die, as I did.
Growing louder with each passing moment. Driving deeper into the night, Jack noticed movement on the roadside. He squinted, unsure of what he was seeing, thinking it might be an animal. But as he got closer, the shapes formed into human figures, standing on the roadside, half hidden in the mist. Some waved cheerfully, but upon closer inspection, their smiles were twisted and maniacal, exuding malicious hatred. Others simply stared, their hollow eyes devoid of life. One figure pressed itself against the windshield, grinning mischievously. Jack held his breath as he slammed on the brakes. The figure vanished as soon as he looked away, leaving only the sound of the truck's tires screeching against the pavement. He gasped for breath, panic rising. What the hell is going on? Jack's eyes darted from side to side, trying to make sense of the shapes in the mist. The highway seemed endless. Jack could feel fatigue setting in. His eyelids grew heavy, and the road stretched on endlessly. He eventually stopped at another rest area, hoping to catch some sleep. Jack leaned back in the cabin, closing his eyes and falling into a deep sleep, the hum of the engine lulling him into a false sense of security. Then Jack woke up with a start. A weight pressed against his chest, making it hard to breathe. His hands were pinned to the seat, leaving him unable to move. A wailing scream tore through the air, very close, as if it came from right in front of Jack. His eyes shot open wide. A figure, a woman, stood before him, her mouth open in a silent scream, her eyes milky white and hollow. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't move. Jack tried to scream, but no sound came out, as if the world was closing in on him. And then everything went dark. He jolted awake, gasping for air. The sun was rising as Jack stepped out of the truck, his body trembling. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had tried to take him. The mist had cleared, but the memory of the woman's wailing cry lingered in Jack's mind. Jack returned to the desolate road he had driven 1,000 times before. Tempted by money, he ignored what he had seen before. The thick fog swallowed everything. A figure, barely visible in the mist, darted in front of the truck. Jack swerved, yanking the wheel hard. The truck veered, narrowly missing the faint figure as it lunged toward him. His breath caught in his throat, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. As the truck wobbled back under control, Jack glanced into the rearview mirror. Nothing, no figure, no movement. Shaking, he took a sip of coffee. The bitter taste did nothing to calm him. It wasn't long before Jack's anxiety turned to sheer terror. Suddenly, an icy chill swept through the cabin, making the hair on his neck stand up. he felt someone sitting beside him. He glanced at the passenger seat. A pale woman with sunken eyes and disheveled black hair, dressed in tattered clothes, sat there in eerie silence. She slowly turned her head to face him, staring intently.
Now it's your turn to pay for the lives you've taken.
Jack gripped the wheel, struggling to keep control of the truck, demanding to know who she was. Then the woman lunged at him, her icy hands tightening around his neck. Jack screamed, but it was choked off. Disoriented, Jack instinctively hit the gas as he struggled to break free from the crushing grip. The truck swerved, its tires screeching on the wet road. Jack's vision blurred, his mind spinning as if he were sinking into darkness. He gripped the wheel with one hand, the other flailing in the air. His fingers passed through her futilely. "Please don't do this." The woman didn't respond, her gaze glowing with a deadly hatred. Jack felt the truck slipping out of control, sliding sideways toward the edge of the road. He tried to hit the brakes, but his legs were numb. Jack's world went black. His body slumped into the seat. The truck careened off the road, the sound of metal scraping against gravel and dirt filling the air until it crashed through the guardrail, plunging into the ravine. The next morning, police investigators arrived at the crash site. The mangled truck lay at the bottom of the ravine, its cargo spilled across the ground. They found Jack's body in the driver's seat, his neck twisted to one side, bruised heavily as if something had crushed it. Investigators and forensic teams began examining the wreckage. Beneath the layers of cargo, they uncovered sealed containers marked with warning labels. Then they uncovered a horrifying truth. Hidden among the legitimate goods were human organs. Jack wasn't just a truck driver. He was a trafficker of human organs, disguised as a legitimate cargo hauler. As the investigation unfolded, it revealed an illicit network that Jack was a part of, operating under protection for years. Many innocent lives had been lost at the hands of these merciless criminals. The ghost of the woman stood at a distance, her purpose fulfilled. For Jack, it was too late. He had no chance to turn back. He had faced the consequences of his actions. The Bloody Delivery. A quiet, secluded suburban neighborhood with winding streets and houses far apart. My name is Nick, and I'm just a pizza delivery guy trying to make a living. Tonight is cold and rainy, the kind of night where windshield wipers have to work overtime. I've been driving these streets for months now, delivering pizzas to people who barely acknowledge me. It's just a job, nothing special. But tonight, I stopped at the same old house. The house that always orders pizza at the strangest hours. It's so remote and isolated. It feels like it belongs to another universe. I've been here so many times I've lost count, but there's always been something off about it. I parked in front of the isolated house at the edge of town, stopping at the end of the gravel driveway, headlights illuminating the crumbling porch. The house looked like it hadn't been cared for in years. Overgrown grass, dusty windows, darkened by old curtains swaying in the wind. I took a deep breath, grabbed the pizza box, and stepped up to the front door, knocking on the heavy wooden frame that echoed loudly. For a moment, nothing. Then, the door creaked open. A woman stood there, her faint smile barely lighting up her pale face, illuminated by dim light from inside. Yet her eyes were distant, unfocused, shadowed. "Here's your pizza," I said cheerfully, trying to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. She reached out for the pizza box, her hand extending. But something about her hand caught my eye. As I handed it to her, I noticed bruises, dark, swollen marks on her pale skin, as if they'd been there for days. I froze for a second, standing there, unsure if I should say something, but decided against it. I quickly withdrew my hand and forced a smile. "Thanks," she mumbled, almost robotic, before pulling the pizza box inside and shutting the door. I got back in my car and sat for a moment, thinking. The rain kept pouring, and the world outside felt heavy. I couldn't shake the image of her trembling hand as she took the pizza box from me. But I drove away, trying to push it out of my mind. It was just a strange coincidence, I told myself. Weeks passed. Same routine. I delivered pizza to the same house every few days. I started to feel uneasy, my curiosity growing. One evening, after handing her the pizza, I hesitated and asked, "Excuse me? May I ask something?" But the woman only smiled faintly, shook her head, and closed the door, leaving me unsettled. Each time, the bruises and scratches on her hands seemed worse, this time even on her face, as if they had just healed and then reappeared. My instincts told me something was very wrong. Tonight, there was no regular order, but then I noticed something strange, a note hastily written in black ink taped to the door. It read, "Deliver to the back door. Knock 3 times, hard." I followed the instructions. This time, it wasn't her but a man. He stood there, bloodshot eyes, clearly intoxicated, his breath reeking of alcohol. He didn't say a word, just glared at me. I instinctively stepped back, trying to keep calm. He reached for the pizza box, snatched it from my hands, stepped inside and slammed the door shut. I left quickly. One evening, I drove past the house again, not to deliver this time, just passing by after my shift. My curiosity got the better of me, and I glanced at the house. In the second-floor window, a figure appeared behind the curtain, flashing a light 3 times, repeatedly, over and over. But then, I saw the shadow of a man behind her, raising his hand as if ready to strike. I froze for a moment. I sat in my car, unable to take my eyes off the house. Something inside me told me I needed to go back. I didn't know what would happen next, but I couldn't ignore it. She needed help. After some thought, I returned to the house, planning to make up an excuse, saying it was a promotional gift for loyal customers. I felt I needed to see the woman again to make sure she was okay. The woman opened the door to pay, her eyes darting down to her hand as if she was deciding whether to say something. I followed her gaze. Then, her hand slowly moved down in an unusual way. She folded her thumb into her palm, then folded all her fingers down. At first, I didn't understand, but then I remembered learning about warning signals. It was the SOS hand signal for help. Before I could react or ask her what was happening, the man appeared behind her and shoved her back. He was still drunk, stumbling toward me with a dark, menacing expression. This time, his face had a fresh scratch, and his clothes were smeared with something unidentifiable, speckled with tiny dark spots. The man looked disoriented, his bloodshot eyes moving sluggishly. He mumbled something incoherent and slammed the door shut. At that moment, I froze in hesitation, unsure if this was my responsibility and whether I was putting myself in danger. Just as I was about to leave, the woman screamed from inside the house. "Help! Please!" Her voice was filled with fear. I dropped the pizza box, instincts kicking in, and rushed through the door without hesitation, quickly moving into the house. I knew a bit about self-defense. I had trained in martial arts for situations like this. As I stepped inside, a scene of chaos unfolded. It was horrifying. She was pinned to the floor, struggling under the man's weight, her face wet with tears, and her hands partially bound. Before I could move, the man charged at me in a fit of rage. But I anticipated the attack, ducked low, and countered with a strong strike to his side, sending him crashing to the floor in pain. Seizing the moment, I pinned him to the floor and used the rope he was tying the woman with to restrain him temporarily, long enough to keep him away from her. He was arrested shortly after, and the truth behind that house came to light. Her name was Angela. The man was her ex-husband. The two had gone through a court-ordered divorce. After she refused to reconcile with him, he kidnapped and tortured her, planning to force her into submission. His recent behavior was the result of a psychotic episode. His obsession turned deadly when she tried to escape. After the incident, I decided to quit my job, unwilling to continue such a dangerous line of work. Angela is now living a happy life with her daughter and her new husband. The Ghosts in the Fog. Tonight, like every other night, I drove my truck down a desolate rural road, taking a sip of coffee to stay awake. The road stretched ahead, cloaked in a thick fog that clung to my headlights. The stillness was eerie. No cars, no animals, just the hum of my engine and the faint crackle of the radio. I considered stopping to wait, but decided to keep going. Moving felt safer than sitting in the dark. A faint smell wafted in, like something metallic. At first, I thought it was just the engine, but it grew stronger, sour and rotten, mingled with the scent of decaying bone. It was stifling, worse than anything I'd ever smelled. I rolled up the window, but the stench lingered, filling the truck like a living thing. My stomach churned violently, and I pulled over to the side of the road. I stumbled out of the truck, gasping for fresh air, but the stench clung to me, lingering in the air. Unable to bear it any longer, I began vomiting. Once I was done, I quickly covered my nose as the smell still hung thick in the air. As I straightened up, I noticed movement ahead, a figure limping across the road, slow and deliberate. The figure was a man. He wore a torn white shirt and black trousers, the fabric old and frayed. I froze, watching him cross the road, oblivious to the faint presence of my truck. His head was slightly bowed, his face obscured by the fog. I climbed back into the cab, intending to approach him. As I drove closer, my headlights illuminated the road ahead, revealing more figures emerging from the fog. All dressed in old-fashioned clothing, moved disjointedly. They limped in unison, heads bowed. They didn't seem to notice me or each other, moving toward the darkness on the other side of the road. I kept driving. Then, from the same direction, a smaller figure appeared, a child, maybe in their early teens. The dense fog surrounded him as he stood motionless on the road, head bowed. Uneasy, I thought the boy might need help. I stopped the truck and stepped out once more. I approached him. "Do you need help?" I called, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to stay calm. The boy didn't respond. Instead, his body remained unnaturally still, his head bowed like a puppet with its strings cut. A heavy silence blanketed the road. I swallowed hard and took another hesitant step forward. Suddenly, the boy's head snapped upward with a jerky motion, the crack of his neck loud enough to echo in the stillness. His face was pale and vacant. I stumbled backward as he tilted his head, as if studying me. Then an impossibly wide mouth opened, a gaping maw that hissed a single word.
"You won't escape!"
Before I could react, he lunged forward, his icy hands clamping around my leg like a vise. He tightened his grip further. I kicked desperately, trying to break free. Pain shot through me as my knee hit the road. I clawed at the ground, panic surging through me. With all my strength, I yanked my leg free and scrambled backward. My hands and knees burned from the sharp gravel, but I didn't care. All I could think about was escaping. The boy stood and started running toward me, his arms flailing and legs bent at unnatural angles. I stumbled toward the truck, with him right behind me. I dove into the cab and slammed the door shut, fumbling with the lock. His scream was deafening, shaking the truck's windows. His grotesque face, with its gaping mouth, pressed against the windshield. His hands slammed against the glass, leaving smears of something dark and viscous. Trembling, I turned the key and slammed my foot on the gas. The truck lurched forward, throwing him off the hood. His twisted body writhed as he stood back up. In the rearview mirror, I saw him standing in the road, surrounded by other nameless figures emerging from the fog. The road stretched endlessly ahead, the fog growing thicker. They stood motionless, watching as my truck sped into the darkness. The road stretched ahead through thick fog. I couldn't stop thinking about the faceless figures I'd seen before. Days had passed since I escaped the boy in the fog. Their hollow presence, the way they lunged toward me, it felt like they were still out there, just beyond the reach of my headlights, waiting for me. But I couldn't turn back. My delivery had to be made, and this was the only road. Then that smell hit me again faintly at first. Metallic, but quickly turning into a stench, sharp and rancid, like rotting meat. My stomach twisted as I tried to breathe through my mouth, but it was no use. Ahead, my dim headlights illuminated an old sign by the roadside. It swayed lightly in the wind, its paint cracked and faded. Danger, though at the time, I had no idea of its significance. My headlights flickered briefly, catching the silhouette of a figure in the distance. I slowed the truck, squinting to see the figure more clearly. It was a man, limping across the road, his form distorted by the fog. I hesitated, unsure whether to stop. Then another figure appeared, and another. All of them moved in the same direction, heads bowed, their movements unnervingly stiff. I continued driving slowly, keeping my distance. The figures kept crossing, oblivious to my truck, disappearing into the fog on the other side. I gripped the wheel tighter. "Just people," I muttered, trying to calm myself. "Just people." Then my tires hit something wet and slippery, causing the truck to swerve. I slammed on the brakes, and then I saw it. A black, wet streak stretched across the asphalt. I stepped out of the truck, the freezing air biting at my skin. The stench hit me, a wave of nausea roiling my stomach. Ahead, the trail led to the carcass of an animal, its body decayed and rotting. Flies buzzed frantically around it, staining the road with wide, dark streaks. I was about to leave, but then something caught my attention farther down the road, shapes moving in the fog. A group of people stood by the roadside. Their movements were strange, unnatural. The next sound that reached me was growling, and perhaps chewing, as if they were gnawing on something. The fog thinned enough for me to see them clearly. I didn't know what they were, but they resembled the things I had seen before, only much more terrifying. Horrifying hollow cavities gaped on their faces and bodies, oozing a black, tar-like fluid. Some of them hunched over another animal carcass, gnawing on its remains with clawed, deformed hands. My gasping breath broke the silence. Then their movements suddenly slowed to a halt. For a moment, I froze, and the others followed suit, all raising their heads in unison. They were looking at me. Then they began running, charging toward me. Their bodies twisted and contorted, their growls morphing into frenzied screams. They were faster than I imagined. I stumbled, fumbling for my keys as I turned back toward the truck. The keys slipped from my hand and fell. I was only a few steps from the truck when something grabbed my leg. I fell hard, hitting the ground. One of them had grabbed my leg. My foot was slick with its slimy grip. In a moment of desperate panic, I twisted and kicked with all my strength to break free. I staggered to my feet and bolted for the truck. I slammed on the gas, speeding away from those grotesque creatures. I didn't stop. My hands ached. The road stretched ahead, silent. In the rearview mirror, all that remained was an empty highway. I swore I would never take that road again. I silently thanked whatever force had kept me alive. The truck driver's scary encounter. The night was quiet. and I was out making overnight deliveries. Miles of open road stretched before me. I glanced at the clock. It was around 2:00 a.m. I decided to stop at a truck stop to refuel and use the restroom, knowing I wouldn't have another chance for quite a while. The truck stop was deserted, except for a few empty trailers parked nearby. I filled up my tank, breathed in the fresh night air, and then headed to the restroom. The stillness was unsettling, a strange quiet that made me feel restless. With a full tank, I climbed back into the truck, heading toward a stretch of road that would take me through dense woods. It was a long, desolate road, flanked by trees on either side, with no towns, no lights, just the road and the dark forest. An hour later, I was deep in the woods, half awake and half asleep, when something caught my attention ahead. At first, I thought I was seeing things, but as I got closer, I realized there was a figure standing at the roadside. The figure was motionless, just standing there, neither waving nor calling for help. They simply watched me pass by, their face a lifeless, emotionless mask. The figure faded into the darkness behind me as I continued driving, but I couldn't shake the image from my mind. About a mile later, I spotted another figure. This time, it was a woman. She stood at the roadside, wearing ripped jeans and a red sweatshirt. As I approached, our eyes met, and a wave of fear washed over me. She didn't move, didn't gesture. She simply stared, her gaze cold and unblinking. I glanced in the rearview mirror, catching a final glimpse of her as she turned her head to watch my truck go by. Her eyes locked onto mine through the glass. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, trying to shake off the fear and keep going. I turned my attention back to the road, and my heart nearly stopped. Lying in the middle of the road was a body, sprawled out, arms and legs wide. I slammed on the brakes, the weight of the truck lurching forward as I came to a sudden stop. My mind raced as I stared at the figure lying in the road. I couldn't tell if they were dead or alive, but they were completely motionless. There were no signs of an accident, no debris, no skid marks, just this body, as if they had simply lain down in the middle of the road. I felt the need to go outside to check on them. The forest loomed on both sides, dense and dark, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that there were eyes lurking in the shadows, just beyond the reach of the headlights. I slowly maneuvered the truck around the body lying in the road, my heart pounding, my mind swirling with doubt. Maybe I should stop and check, just to make sure they were okay. I parked the truck a short distance away, and reluctantly, I stepped outside, but there was something about the way they were lying. I was almost there when a horrifying realization struck me. The body was no longer lying on the ground. It was standing upright, staring directly at me with empty, soulless eyes. That figure took a step forward, his movements jerky. Perhaps that was when I realized I had been lured into a trap. I turned to run back to the truck, but the figure lunged forward, moving quickly, intent on hunting me. I had no choice but to flee into the woods. Then I stumbled and fell hard to the ground. A sharp pain shot through my ankle as I tried to get up, but that figure had come closer, a malicious look on their face. I grabbed a fairly large broken branch and held it out in front of me as he slowly approached with a sinister smile. I fought back with everything I had, but he was very strong, moved quickly, and was brutal. When he kicked me in the hip, I staggered backward. I thought everything was over, but a loud explosion echoed through the trees. I followed his gaze and saw a hunter standing nearby, his rifle aimed directly at my attacker. Under the dim moonlight, the hunter's tough and determined face pulled the trigger. The attacker staggered back, clutching his shoulder, dazed for a moment. The attacker staggered, trying to flee, but he was no match for the hunter. The hunter quickly seized him, easily subduing him. He started pulling out his phone and calling the police. I fell to the ground, relief and exhaustion washing over me at the same time. Soon, the flashing lights of police cars cut through the darkness, illuminating the forest. Officers approached, weapons drawn, securing the area as they took my statement. A few days later, I learned the police's conclusion. They called me into the station for a statement and some information. I found out that the man I had encountered, the one lying in the road, was not a stranger to the area. They identified him as a notorious criminal, wanted for a series of highway robberies targeting truck drivers. He and his accomplices planned and staged fake accidents to lure drivers out of their vehicles. They would lie in wait in the woods, ready to ambush anyone who fell into their trap. The strange encounters I had with the figures by the roadside were all part of their twisted game, a psychological tactic to unsettle and confuse victims before the final act. Thanks to the intervention of the hunter and the swift response of the police, they tracked down the criminals and apprehended him. With him now facing serious charges, I knew he wouldn't be lurking in the shadows, preying on unsuspecting people any longer. The haunting of Route 23. I've been doing this job for over 20 years, driving on long, desolate highways at all hours. As a truck driver, I've gotten used to isolation, to the silence of the road. As a truck driver, I've also had to get used to sometimes sleeping in dangerous places. I was driving along Route 23, a road known for its long, deserted stretches. It's a 30-mile stretch of highway surrounded by endless rows of trees and dark tunnels. I had been driving for 3 hours, and I usually stop for a break after 4. I didn't particularly like this road, but I had no other choice. I spotted a small parking lot up ahead, a flat patch of land nestled between the trees. It was just big enough for my truck. I turned in and parked there. The dense trees surrounded me with a sense of desolation and silence. I stepped outside to brush my teeth. While brushing, I heard the sound of an engine echoing in the distance. A car was approaching, but instead of passing by, it slowly crept closer. Its windows were dark, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Something wasn't right. I hurried back to the safety of my truck, slamming the door shut. I wrapped the seatbelt around the handle, an old trucker's trick, to make it harder for anyone to open the door from the outside. I had done this many times before in dangerous places, but tonight, it felt necessary. I pulled the curtain shut and lay down on the bed in the back of the truck, covering myself with the blanket. But the fatigue from the long drive soon took over, and within minutes, I was fast asleep. It felt like I had just closed my eyes when a noise woke me up. It was footsteps, soft and slow, circling the truck. Then they stopped right outside the driver's door. Then came a loud, violent knock on the door. I jolted up, almost falling out of bed. The knocking on the door grew more frantic, more aggressive. My hands fumbled as I tried to shove my shoes on. I shouted, "Who's out there?" But there was no answer, just the banging getting louder. I rushed to the driver's seat, my hands shaking as I shoved the key into the ignition. The truck roared to life. I pulled the curtain aside, ready to drive off. And that's when I saw him. A man, dressed all in black, stood just inches from the truck. He held a large knife in one hand and a hammer in the other. We locked eyes, and he twisted his face into a grotesque, maniacal grin. He seemed unhinged. Then he lifted the knife in front of me, as if taunting and provoking me. My truck suddenly stalled. I hit the horn, warning him I would charge if he didn't back off. But instead of retreating, the man started walking toward me. He quickened his pace. Then he started sprinting toward me, yelling as he ran. The knife and hammer swung wildly in his hands as he charged at the truck. I realized my window was still cracked open. I reached to close it, but before I could, his face was pressed against the glass. His wild eyes stared into mine. He grinned, nodding toward the window. With a sudden swing, the hammer smashed against the driver's side window. The glass shook but held. My hands trembled as I tried to restart the engine. Another swing. This time, the glass shattered. A third swing. Cracks spiderwebbed across the window. It was about to give completely. My life hung by a thread. The engine roared to life, and I slammed my foot on the gas just as the window opened. The man screamed as the truck lunged forward, throwing him off balance. His hammer was still lodged in the broken window as I sped away. In the rearview mirror, I saw him stand up. He stood in the middle of the road, watching as I drove away. His silhouette was clearly visible in the mirror. I haven't driven like that since. That night taught me to always be prepared, to plan my route down to the smallest detail. Now, I sleep in safer places, far from empty parking lots. The last ride. I had been driving for Uber for about 6 months, mostly at night. The pay wasn't great, but the quiet streets and dark city made it tolerable. People always had their own stories to tell, and most rides were uneventful. Drunk passengers, late-night partygoers, or quiet workers returning home. But one night changed everything. It was a Friday, a little past 1:00 a.m. I was sitting in my car, parked near the downtown area, waiting for my next fare. The streets were mostly empty, a light mist hanging in the air. My phone pinged with a new ride request. The pickup was in an isolated area on the outskirts of town, where the streetlights were few and far between. I hesitated for a moment, but accepted the ride. As I drove through the quiet streets, the mist thickened into a fog, making it harder to see more than a few feet ahead. The GPS directed me down a narrow, winding road, surrounded by trees on both sides. I glanced at my phone. Destination, a spot marked only as unknown road. The location seemed remote, almost too remote, but I shrugged it off. People lived in weird places all the time. When I pulled up to the pickup location, there was no house, just a dirt path leading into the woods. I waited, glancing nervously at the trees, their branches looming overhead like skeletal fingers. My phone chimed again, a message from the rider. "I'll be right out." I watched the darkness, waiting for someone to emerge, but minutes passed and no one appeared. Just as I was about to cancel the ride, I saw movement. A figure stepped out from the fog, walking slowly toward the car. My headlights illuminated a tall man, wearing a long, dark coat. His face was hidden in the shadows, but something about him felt off. He opened the back door and slid into the seat without a word. "Where to?" I asked, trying to mask the unease creeping into my voice. The man didn't respond right away. After a long pause, he said in a low, raspy voice,
Just drive.
Every instinct in my body screamed at me to cancel the ride and get out of there, but I didn't want to make a scene. I started the car and pulled away from the curb, glancing at him in the rearview mirror. He was staring out the window, his face still obscured by the shadows of the back seat. As I drove, the fog thickened, making it hard to see the road ahead. The man remained silent, his presence heavy and unsettling. Every now and then I'd glance in the mirror, and he'd just be sitting there, motionless. The tension in the car was suffocating. After a few minutes, I broke the silence. "So, where exactly are we going?" The man slowly turned his head to face me. His eyes met mine in the mirror, and I felt a chill run down my spine.
We're going home.
He whispered. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Who's home?" He leaned forward, his face now partially visible in the dim light of the dashboard. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his eyes were hollow, empty.
Yours.
He said, his voice barely above a whisper. A wave of terror washed over me. I slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt. My heart raced as I turned to confront him, but the back seat was empty. The door was still locked, and the fog outside pressed against the windows like a living thing. I sat there, frozen, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I checked the mirror again. Nothing. I turned in my seat, but the back seat was completely empty. The man was gone. Shaking, I grabbed my phone and checked the ride. The request had vanished, as if it had never existed. There was no record of the trip, no rider profile, nothing. I sped away from the spot, the fog swallowing the road behind me. When I got home, I locked every door and window, my hands trembling as I did so. I don't know what I encountered, but the image of the man's sunken eyes and his cold words echoed in my mind and seemed impossible to forget. I never drove for Uber again after that night, and every time I pass by that isolated road, I feel a cold dread settle in my chest. Somewhere out there, the man in the dark coat is still waiting for his next ride. Stranger on the way home. I was driving home on a quiet, deserted road, my headlights cutting through the thick darkness. A familiar road I had traveled countless times. I was still about 10 minutes away from home when my car began to slow down. Confused, I pressed the gas pedal, but the car continued to lose speed. Panic set in as I realized the problem I had run out of gas. I suddenly remembered the low fuel warning light had come on, but I had forgotten about it, and in my rush, I had completely missed stopping to refuel. My car stalled, leaving me stranded in the middle of nowhere. I stepped out of the car, the chilly night air biting at my skin. Glancing at my phone, I saw the worst: no signal. I wasn't surprised. This road had no reception. I stood there for a moment, weighing my options. It was nearly midnight, and there was no point in calling anyone. My friends were likely already asleep. I knew the area well enough to remember a gas station about a mile away. It would take 20 minutes to walk, maybe less, and the weather was fairly mild. So I decided I would make the quick trip. I grabbed an empty gas can I kept in the back of my car for my lawnmower. At least luck was on my side in some small way. There were no streetlights, only dense forests on either side. The road was eerily quiet. Only one or two cars passed by, their headlights briefly illuminating the empty road before vanishing into the night. As I walked, my footsteps crunched on the gravel by the roadside. Every sound seemed amplified by the stillness. I felt a bit uneasy, but I kept walking. Then, I heard it. It was the sound of a car engine behind me. I stopped and turned around. A pickup truck was slowly approaching the spot where my car had broken down. My first thought was that they might stop to help, and for a brief moment, I considered asking for a ride. But then I saw them, 2 men. They got out of the truck, their faces quickly obscured by black masks pulled over their heads. One of them shined a phone flashlight into the window, while the other knocked on the door. They tried to open it, but of course, the doors were locked. I crouched down and moved closer to the edge of the forest, hiding in the shadows. Maybe they hadn't seen me yet, but they were rummaging through my car. Panic rose in me when one of them turned and looked in my direction. Suddenly, he started walking toward me. I froze. The other man got back in the truck, and I heard the engine roar as it sped forward, heading straight for me. I didn't have time to think. I sprinted into the forest. Behind me, I could hear the man crashing through the undergrowth, chasing me. I couldn't stop. I couldn't let them catch me. In what felt like an eternity, I ran through the edge of the forest, dodging trees and leaping over fallen logs. After a few minutes, I saw a large, isolated house ahead of me. I ran behind the house, pressing myself against the rough, cold brick wall. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath, my ears straining to hear any sound of pursuit. I crouched there for a few minutes. Finally, I dared to move, cautiously slipping through the backyard toward the old path. I didn't want to knock on the door because it was too late, and I didn't want to cause them any alarm. I walked on high alert, every sound making me shiver. I looked around the area. No truck, no sign of the men. I continued walking toward the gas station. Another car came, and without thinking, I rushed back into the forest, hiding until the sound of the engine faded away. Finally, the gas station appeared in front of me. I felt relief as I filled up the gas canister. When I finally made it back to my car, I shakily poured the gas into the tank. I drove straight home, too scared to look back. As I sat in the safety of my own home, I couldn't shake the thought of those men, and I realized how lucky I was to have made it home safely. Mysterious driver in the desert. Gavi was driving down an empty desert highway, stretching for miles, barren and silent. He had been driving for hours. The only sound was the crackling of his car's radio, which seemed to be breaking down, with only static and the occasional country tune. This was one of the rare times Gavi passed through here. He glanced at his dashboard map. No towns, no gas stations for miles. Just an empty, desolate road. As Gavi approached a small hill on the road, he felt a sense of relief. The slight slope broke the endless flatness, providing a brief change. But as he went downhill, something caught his attention in the distance. At first, he couldn't tell what it was. Just a shape, a dark figure faintly illuminated by the moonlight. But as he got closer, the figure took form a person standing on the side of the road. Gavi slowed down, squinting to get a better look. It was a woman, standing alone in the middle of nowhere. She wore a long white dress and had pale skin. Her long black hair hung over her face as if soaked in water. Gavi muttered, wondering what she was doing out here. There was nothing for miles. No cars, no houses. How did she even get here? Gavi slowed the car further, considering whether to stop. Maybe she was lost. But as he got closer, something sent a chill down his spine. Her hair looked too wet, as if she had just walked out of a rainstorm, even though the desert had been dry for weeks. And her face, what little he could see of it, her eyes were too large, unblinking, staring straight at Gavi through the wet strands of hair. He hit the gas, speeding past her in fear. Even though he tried to convince himself she was just a lost traveler or perhaps a prank, Gavi couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. Minutes passed, and Gavi continued driving through the endless desert, the eerie calm returning. He kept glancing in the rear-view mirror, feeling as if someone was watching him. He shook his head, trying to stay focused, but then Gavi saw another hill in the distance, just like the one he had passed earlier. And after a short drive, there she was again. The same woman, the same white dress, the same wet hair covering her face. But this time, she was closer to the road, and her smile was even wider, more unnatural. Gavi couldn't believe his eyes. How could she have gotten here before him? There was no way she could have moved that fast. He didn't think twice and slammed his foot on the gas, speeding forward to get past her. This time, Gavi didn't dare look back. Another hill appeared ahead, and the familiar fear tightened in Gavi's chest. He didn't want to go over it, didn't want to see her again, but he had no choice. His worst fear came true. She was there again, standing and waving at him. Her smile now impossibly wide, stretching nearly from ear to ear, and her cold, soulless eyes stared directly at Gavi. Maybe she was some sort of hallucination conjured by his imagination. No matter how much he tried, the fear continued to gnaw at him. He had heard the stories of haunted highways, of strange ghosts appearing to night travelers, but he had never believed them until now. He couldn't keep driving and needed to stop to escape this cursed road. but there was no exit, no rest stop. Gavi felt trapped with no way out. And then, the radio started crackling again. He reached out with a trembling hand to adjust the dial. But before he could turn it off, Gavi felt something cold touch the back of his neck. He froze. Reaching from behind the driver's seat was a pair of pale white hands. The fingers wrapped around his face, slowly digging their nails into his skin. Gavi was now about to face something he didn't understand, and he still had a secret he was hiding. Mysterious driver in the desert. Those fingers, they were slowly tightening around Gavi's face. They were icy cold. Cold like the touch of death itself. He was frozen in place. Slowly, with fear creeping down his spine, he turned to look. Gavi couldn't see the face those hands belonged to, but he had the sense it was a woman. Was it the woman? The one he'd passed many times on the highway? His mind was flooded with horror. The car swerved violently as the grip on him tightened. The tires screeched against the road. The car was losing control. The car veered off the highway, crashing into the rocky terrain with a sharp, grating sound. The impact was brutal, throwing him against the steering wheel as the airbag deployed. Pain surged through his body. Gavi's head hit the window, and for a moment, everything seemed to blur. Smoke rose from the crumpled hood, the headlights flickering dimly on the dark horizon. Gavi's vision swam as he tried to focus. He was still alive. Gavi could feel blood trickling down one side of his face. His limbs were heavy, weighed down. He tried to move, but his body wouldn't respond. Then, he blacked out. In the distance, a car approached. The officer, a seasoned man who had seen his share of accidents, stepped out of his vehicle, his flashlight cutting through the desert's dark night. The car was a wreck. Twisted metal and shattered glass scattered across the rocky ground. Smoke still rose from the engine. The officer cautiously approached. The officer, Jay, shone his flashlight through the driver's side window. His eyes widened in shock when he saw the body still strapped into the seatbelt. After checking the license plate, he realized it was someone named Gavi. His head was twisted at a strange angle, almost wrenched to the side, and his eyes wouldn't close, wide open as if staring right at me. His face frozen in a horrifying grimace, blood smeared across his skin. But just as Jay started to step back, he heard something. A sound like someone crying, but it was muffled, as if something was blocking their mouth. The sound came from the trunk. At first, it was faint, barely audible. But as Jay leaned in to investigate, it grew louder, more desperate. It was a sobbing, painful cry, like that of a child trapped inside. Panic surged through the officer as he ran to the back of the car. His hands trembled as he fumbled with the trunk latch. Jay's mind raced with questions. Who could be inside? What had happened? 2 cases at once? The trunk lid sprang open. Jay's flashlight illuminated a haunting sight inside the cramped trunk, a little girl. A young girl, bound and gagged. Her wrists and ankles were tied tightly with thick, rough rope, and her mouth was sealed with tape. Tears streamed down her pale face, her eyes wide with fear. Not just that clutched tightly to her chest was a doll. The doll wore a white dress, its skin pale and cracked with age, its face fixed in a disturbingly wide smile. Large, dark eyes stared back, and its long black hair appeared wet, hanging loose. Jay reached out to touch the doll, and then its head moved. The girl sobbed, her body trembling as she clung to the doll. Jay staggered back, the weight of the doll's gaze pressing on him. He turned away, his breath becoming ragged, his heart pounding in his chest. The officer fought back his rising panic. It was just a coincidence, he told himself. He quickly untied the girl and removed the tape from her mouth. She gasped for air, sobbing loudly. Jay reassured the girl and led her to his patrol car. He called for backup. From the moment they got into the car, The doll sat there, staring at him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching him, studying him with its eerie and unsettling gaze. Soon after, backup and paramedics arrived. The girl was taken to the hospital, still clutching the doll, which baffled him. Her small hands clung to it as if it were the only thing tethering her. As the ambulance drove away, Jay remained haunted by the strange presence of the doll. He pondered the mysterious events leading up to the crash. Even though the girl had been rescued, the story felt far from over. It seemed to have slipped beyond Jay's understanding, perhaps into another world entirely. The stalker in the Dunkin' Donuts parking lot. It was just an ordinary morning. My usual routine, a quick coffee stop at Dunkin' Donuts before heading to work. I don't go there every day, only when I feel like treating myself. Today, I decided to visit my usual spot. The store was busy, as expected, with the familiar noise of orders and chatter filling the space. I lined up, placed my order, and within minutes, I had my coffee in hand. As I stepped out of Dunkin', the sun was high, and the parking lot was crowded. People were rushing off to work, grabbing breakfast, nothing unusual, except for one thing. There was a man standing near my car. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, near the passenger seat, wearing a black coat, with his head slightly tilted as if listening to something. I tried not to think too much about it. People do weird things sometimes, right? Maybe he was just waiting for someone. I pressed the unlock button on my remote, the faint beep cutting through the quiet, and I headed for the driver's seat. The plan was simple: get in, start the car, drive off, and forget about it. As soon as I got inside, an uneasy feeling ran down my spine. I put the key in the ignition, and just as I was about to start the car, the passenger door opened. The man got in. For a second, I just stared, frozen in disbelief. He didn't look at me. He didn't say a word. He just sat there, staring out the window. My heart raced. I didn't understand what was happening. I turned to him, my voice shaky. "I think you're in the wrong car." Silence. He didn't even acknowledge me. The tension was palpable. I said it again, louder this time. "You're in the wrong car." Still nothing. He just stared out the window, his expression blank, detached. That's when the fear set in. I told him to get out or I'd call the police. My voice was firmer now, desperate. And then it happened. Without warning, he turned toward me, glaring. His hand shot toward the ignition, and before I could react, he grabbed my keys. For a moment, we struggled. He held my keys in a tight grip, and before I knew what was happening, he swung at me, using the keys as a weapon. He swung it toward my face. I dodged, but I knew I had to get out of there. I pushed open the driver's door and bolted. I ran, gasping, panicking, not stopping until I was back inside Dunkin' Donuts. I grabbed my phone and called 911, barely able to explain what had just happened. Through the large glass windows of the store, I saw him driving off in my car, disappearing down the street. The next few minutes were a blur. The police arrived, took my statement, and I filled out a report, my mind still reeling from what had just happened. A few hours later, I received news. The police discovered my car by the woods in an empty state, and no one was in it. But something felt off. Even after I got my car back, the image of him sitting silently in the passenger seat, his vacant expression, lingered in my mind. Who was he? Why had he chosen my car? Weeks had passed since that strange man entered my car, and every visit to Dunkin' Donuts filled me with discomfort. Today was no different. I stood in line, ordered my coffee, and tried to convince myself that everything would be fine, that he wouldn't come back. It was early evening when I grabbed my coffee and stepped outside. I scanned the area, my eyes instantly locking onto a familiar figure standing at the edge of the woods. It was him. This time, he didn't have that vacant look. Instead, he stood there, head tilted, grinning eerily and waving at me as if teasing. A chill ran down my spine. My heart raced in my chest as I hesitated, unsure of what to do. Somehow, he didn't chase after me. Instead, he casually opened the passenger door and sat back inside my car with that same blank expression. This time, he didn't drive away. He just sat there, staring at me through the windshield as if waiting for something. I began to call the police. They arrived within minutes. I stepped aside, watching them cautiously approach the vehicle. The man remained still. He sat there, his emotionless eyes fixed ahead, oblivious to the events unfolding around him. One of the officers commanded him to step out of the car. For a moment, it seemed like he ignored their orders. But then, he slowly turned his head, his expression oddly calm. He opened the door and stepped out of the car, raising his hands as if surrendering. A few hours later, I sat in the police station, recounting the incident as if it was the 100th time. My arm still throbbed with old bandages covering the cuts from the key. They told me he had been arrested, and after taking his fingerprints, they discovered he had a long history of mental illness. His records showed he had been in and out of psychiatric facilities for years, diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. His delusions had worsened over time, and it seemed he had fixated on me for reasons no one could explain. They said he saw things, heard voices screaming incoherently when there was nothing around. They believed he couldn't distinguish reality from fantasy. A wave of relief washed over me, but it was mixed with sadness. The man who had terrorized me was not just a criminal. He was sick. His mind had warped reality into something unrecognizable, and I had become part of that nightmare. As I left the police station, I couldn't shake the image of him sitting in my car, staring out the window, detached from the world. He had been arrested, and the officers assured me he would be taken back to a mental facility where he could receive the treatment he desperately needed. But the scars he left, both physical and mental, would take much longer to heal. I stood next to the car, hesitating to open the door, reluctant to sit in the driver's seat where everything had happened. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to unlock the door and get into the driver's seat. I started the engine and drove out of the parking lot, determined to move forward. After all, everything was finally over. The outcome of the Hitchhiker Man. I was working the third shift at a 24/7 diner in a quiet town. Most of our customers were truck drivers and travelers passing through. But the strangest people I've ever met were the drifters, addicts, and hitchhikers. That night started like any other. Carl, the cook, had been working at this place for over 15 years, and he had seen it all. His sharp eyes could spot trouble from a mile away. We were perfectly in sync. I served tables, and he flipped burgers. With a new cast in the pipeline, and he flipped burgers. Around 4 a.m., the shift was well underway. The place was completely silent, not a single person in sight. The only sound breaking the silence was the hum of the old refrigerator. Suddenly, the door creaked open. A man stumbled in, clutching his right arm to his chest. He didn't say a word, just shuffled past Carl and me, heading straight to the bathroom. His clothes were torn and filthy, and his face was twisted in pain. Carl and I exchanged glances. We'd seen strange customers before, but there was something off about this guy, more than just a regular drifter. I asked Carl, "Doesn't he look familiar?" After a moment, I remembered. That guy had come in before, begging for food and a ride. We had to kick him out because he was bothering the customers. But now, something had changed. He looked panicked, like he had seen something terrifying. Carl just shook his head, muttering, Here we go again. I looked at the bathroom door. I didn't want to check on him, but I didn't have much choice. Carl handed me the keys, nodding toward the bathroom. Go check if he's all right. I knocked on the door, asking if he needed help, but there was no response. I knocked again, harder this time. Still, nothing. I called out, fumbling with the keys. I pushed the door open, saying I was coming in. The bathroom was empty. No trace of the man. No dirt, no blood, nothing. The bathroom was as clean as the night before. I froze at the doorway. End and year and ye and Andra. I screamed for Carl. He rushed over. I backed away as he pushed past me, staring into the spotless room with wide, disbelieving eyes. We stood behind the counter, both of us trying to make sense of what had just happened. How could he have disappeared? I looked at Carl, but he had the same horrified expression as I did. Then I saw movement near the front window. The man was outside, staring at us. His face was worse than before, bloody, swollen, and his eyes were bleeding. But what froze me in place was how his right hand hung limply at his side, looking like it was about to snap off. His thumb was sticking straight up, unnaturally stiff, as if he was trying to hitch a ride. Before I could grab the phone to call 911, a loud noise echoed from the back of the diner. Carl and I rushed to the back. It was coming from the freezer. Someone was tearing into the food boxes. Carl grabbed a knife from the counter, and we slowly moved in. The man was inside, tearing open a box of frozen meatballs and pressing a pile of meat against his arm, like he was possessed. But his arm, it wasn't right. His hand was dangling, almost detached from his wrist. For a moment, everything went still. We locked eyes on him, witnessing something we couldn't believe. Then, at an unnatural speed, he bolted past us, kicked the kitchen door open, and ran outside. Carl and I stood there, too shocked to react. We had just witnessed the impossible. Carl hurried to the front, locked the diner doors, and turned off the lights, plunging the place into darkness. The only light now came from the neon sign outside, casting a dim red glow on the counter. I stood in the middle of the kitchen, my hands trembling. My mind raced, trying to piece together what had just happened. That man, if he was really injured, was moving with an unnatural speed and strength. And those eyes, it was like something else was controlling him. When I looked out the window, the parking lot was empty. There was no sign of the man. Carl stood with me, his face tense, his eyes scanning the darkness outside. I asked Carl what we should do now, and if we should call the police. Carl shook his head and said they wouldn't believe us, and there was no way to explain this. He reconsidered, slowly walking to the phone and picking up the receiver. But just as he dialed 911, the lights in the diner flickered. The hum of the refrigerator went silent, and for a moment, everything was still. Then, in the darkness, we heard a soft, slow tapping on the window. We bolted through the kitchen, with Carl leading the way. I glanced back just in time to see the glass shatter, and the man crawling through the window like a wild animal. Carl pushed open the back door, and we stumbled out into the alley behind the diner. Carl panted, glancing around. We need to get to the car. We sprinted down the alley, the man's footsteps echoing behind us. He was faster than I expected, his heavy breathing growing louder as he closed in on us. I could hear his raspy voice muttering something, words I couldn't quite make out. Carl reached the car, fumbling with the keys, urging me to get in quickly as the doors unlocked. I yanked the door open and jumped inside just as Carl started the engine. The headlights flicked on, illuminating the man standing at the end of the alley. Now he was covered in blood, his smile wider as he slowly raised his thumb again, rigid and grotesque, like a hitchhiker's signal. Tires screeched as Carl slammed on the gas, and the truck sped out of the alley and onto the road. I glanced into the rearview mirror, my heart still racing. The man stood motionless at the edge of the diner, watching us disappear into the night. We didn't speak for the first few miles, both of us too stunned to process what had just happened. We drove in silence for the next hour, trying to put as much distance as possible between us and that place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. I eventually called the police to report the incident. To my surprise, they told us to head toward a location near the diner. They confirmed that a man matching that description had been reported. A man had been killed in a hit and run accident near the ramp, not far from the diner. As I got closer, I saw it. It was the same man. His body lay by the roadside, his clothes covered in dirt. But the eeriest part was his right hand, still holding that thumb up, just like before. According to the report, the man had survived the initial accident earlier that night and had been able to walk. His desperate search for help led him to our diner before he collapsed on the road. But there was more to the story. It turned out that this man had been involved in a series of violent incidents years earlier, hitchhiking across states and attacking those who picked him up. The police pieced together his history, a fugitive, infamous for attacking victims and vanishing into the night. The accident had broken his body, but it didn't kill him immediately. He had stumbled into the diner, seeking refuge, only to return to the streets, where he was eventually found dead. The police said he had been trying to use his injury to manipulate others. We were lucky to have escaped him. As I stood in the parking lot, staring at the diner, everything started to make sense. The man wasn't a ghost. He was real. Maybe he had finally paid the price in the same way he had hurt others on the road. That was where his twisted journey had come to an end. Trucker's Secret Mission. Another long and quiet night on the highway. The road stretched endlessly before me, illuminated only by the headlights of my truck. I had been driving this road for years, working undercover as a long-haul truck driver. My real job was much more dangerous, tracking criminals, operating on these desolate roads under the cover of darkness. I am an undercover cop. My truck is my weapon, my disguise, and my hideout. Tonight was supposed to be like any other night, but I had a feeling, something gnawing at the back of my mind, telling me that tonight would be different, so I needed to be extra cautious. The road was deserted. The only sounds were my engine and the occasional rustle of wind over the barren landscape. I kept my eyes on the road, scanning the distance for any signs of trouble. Criminals often use these isolated highways to conduct their business, and I've made it my mission to stop them. Suddenly, I spotted a figure standing by the roadside, waving for me to stop. It was late, too late for anyone to be out here. My instincts kicked in immediately. Something was off. I slowed down and stopped by the roadside. The man approached, his face shrouded in darkness. He looked disheveled, almost deranged. As he got closer, I could see his clothes were torn and filthy. His hands twitched nervously at his sides, and there was a wild look in his eyes. I cautiously rolled down my window. "Do you need help?" But there was something about this guy, something dangerous. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he smiled a slow, eerie smile that sent chills down my spine. Then, he pulled something out from under his coat, a small black box. I recognized it immediately. It was a vial containing a dangerous, illegal substance, something that could be lethal on contact. My heart beats fast. This is no ordinary hitchhiker. He is a dangerous man, and his target is me. The man stepped closer, holding the vial in one hand and a small knife in the other. "Get out of the truck," he said, his voice low and threatening, "or I'll make sure you don't make it through the night." I knew what was in that vial. It was a more dangerous weapon than the knife he held. Just one drop could incapacitate me, or worse, kill me. He knew it too. That's why he smiled like that. I kept my cool. My training kicked in. I had dealt with guys like him before, unpredictable and dangerous. But this time was different. He wasn't just a criminal, he was playing a twisted game, and I was his target tonight. I slowly unlocked the door, my mind racing as I tried to think of my next move. The man continued to smile, his eyes gleaming with some sick satisfaction. "Come on," he taunted, waving the knife. "Get out of the truck, Brian." I froze. How did he know my name? I had never met this guy in my life, yet he knew who I was. He stepped closer, holding up the vial. "You think you're so smart, don't you? Driving around here pretending to be a hero, catching guys like me. I've been watching you for a long time." The truth hit me like a punch. This wasn't random. He had planned this, but maybe he didn't know I was really a cop. I climbed out of the truck, raising my hands to show compliance. My mind raced, searching for an opportunity. The man circled around me, still grinning like a madman. He sneered, starting to pace back and forth, waving the knife and vial as he spoke. His words grew more erratic. He muttered something about me stealing it from him, but I couldn't even remember what it was. I racked my brain, trying to recall him. I had taken down countless criminals in my time. Drug dealers, traffickers, murderers. Any of them could have a grudge. But this guy, his face didn't ring any bells. His eyes burned with hatred as he said, "Now I'm going to ruin your life." He stepped closer, waving the vial in front of me. He whispered, "Just one drop, and it'll all be over." I stood still, watching his every move. He was too close, too confident. He thought he had won, but he was careless, distracted by his own need for revenge. Suddenly, luck was on my side. As he rambled, I noticed a flaw in his plan: the way he loosely held the knife. How distracted he was. He was too immersed in his own twisted game. Luckily, every time I went on a mission, I always wore gloves to protect myself from hazardous materials. Without warning, I lunged forward, knocking the vial from his hand, sending it skidding across the pavement. He was shocked, but not for long. He swung the knife at me, but I was ready because I had been through it and knew how to handle it. I grabbed his wrist and twisted until he dropped the blade. The struggle was quick and brutal. I used every trained skill to subdue him, pinning him to the ground before he could react. He thrashed, cursing and screaming, but it was over. I had him. As I held him down, panting from the exertion, I asked, "Who are you? Why are you doing this?" He just laughed a cold, empty laugh. I stared at him, the pieces falling into place. He was one of the first criminals I had ever apprehended, a drug trafficker. He didn't forget I waited, planned, burned my hatred for years. I squeezed him. His words stabbed deeper than any weapon. He didn't pursue money or drugs or even freedom. He pursues revenge aimlessly and empty. Once he was subdued, I discreetly pressed for backup, making sure no one knew my true identity, while I waited for the other officers to arrive. I couldn't shake the chill down my spine. This man, this forgotten criminal, had built his entire life around destroying me. The lights of the patrol cars approached. This job wasn't just about catching criminals. It was about the shadows that follow you, carrying grudges from the past that never truly go away. My colleagues took him away. For every criminal I took down, there would be another waiting, another with a grudge, another seeing me as the one who ruined their lives. But now I understood more. The real danger wasn't out there on the road. It was in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. Scary night at the toy store. The night sky was heavy. and the large parking lot outside a quiet toy store was dimly lit by a few sparse streetlights. The store was about to close, and Sana, a woman in her 30s, walked toward the entrance. She held a list tightly in her hand. Her daughter's 6th birthday was coming up soon. Inside, the store was nearly empty. Sana walked past shelves filled with toys. She felt excited as she picked up stuffed animals and birthday decorations. As she walked, she had the unsettling feeling that someone was watching her. She glanced over and saw a man at the end of the aisle. He wore a long black coat and had a hat pulled low over his face. He just stood there, staring at her. Sana immediately looked away, pretending not to notice, but she could feel his eyes burning into her. She grabbed the last item on her list and moved to a different aisle, hoping to shake the strange and uneasy feeling. For the next 15 minutes, she tried to continue shopping, moving through different parts of the store. She hurried through checkout, her nerves on edge. After paying, she headed for the exit. The parking lot was almost empty, except for her car and a suspicious gray SUV parked nearby. The vast emptiness made the SUV's proximity unsettling. As she neared her car, Sana's heart raced when she heard a car door open from the other side of the SUV. The man in the black coat emerged from around the SUV. It was the same man from the store. Her fear began to rise as she recognized him. She thought she needed to hide for a while. Sana hurried inside, her breath quickening. The store was nearly empty now, and the isolation was overwhelming. She moved through the aisles, trying to lose the man in the maze of shelves. Every few minutes, she glanced over her shoulder. The man was there, trailing her through the store. He kept his distance but never let her out of his sight. Her hands trembled as she pulled out her phone. She quickly dialed her husband, and when he answered, she whispered urgently into the phone. He promised he would be there in less than 10 minutes. The minutes felt like hours as she moved around the store, pretending to browse but always keeping an eye on the man. At one point, he seemed to lose interest and walked toward the exit, but as Sana neared the checkout counter, he lined up right behind her. The air felt stifling. She quickly moved through rows of stuffed animals and dolls, praying that the man wouldn't see her anymore. She crouched behind a shelf, pressing her back against it. She looked around, but didn't see him anywhere. For a moment, she dared to hope that he had really left. But then, the soft sound of footsteps on the floor shattered her illusion of safety. He rounded the corner, his figure looming larger as he got closer. Sana's back pressed against the shelf, and a row of dolls wobbled. She flinched in fear as one of them fell to the ground with a soft thud. The man stopped just a few feet away. She glanced, her eyes alert, watching his every move. This close, she could make out more details. His gloved hands, the lower part of his face visible beneath the brim of his hat. A faint, crooked smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. He took another step toward her. He reached into his coat, and for a moment, Sana's heart stopped. Was he pulling out a weapon? What was he about to do? Suddenly, headlights swept across the parking lot as a car pulled in. Sana's husband had arrived, and his car stopped right in front of the toy store. The man glanced toward the lights, his expression stiffening, growing cautious. He stepped back into the shadows as Sana's husband drew closer. Sana saw her husband get out of the car. He walked toward the store, his eyes scanning the parking lot for her. She seized the moment and ran past the man, her heart pounding as she sprinted toward the store entrance. She didn't look back, but she could feel his eyes burning into her as she escaped. Sana rushed through the front door of the store, running toward her husband. Her face was pale, and her hands were trembling, but she was safe. She collapsed into his arms, her breath coming in gasps as the fear that had overwhelmed her began to fade. Her husband looked past her, scanning the store for the man, but the parking lot had returned to its eerie calm. The man in the black coat had disappeared, melting into the shadows. Her husband gripped the steering wheel, ready to drive them home, but Sana couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Later that night, Sana's phone rang. It was a call from the local police station. The man had been caught. They wanted her to come in and give a statement. The man had been arrested just hours after leaving the parking lot. A patrol car had spotted his SUV parked suspiciously in another lot near a shopping mall. When the police approached him casually, he resisted arrest, acting erratically. Sana listened intently as the detective began revealing disturbing details that had come to light after his arrest. During questioning, the man, identified as Dennis, initially refused to cooperate. He claimed he was just shopping late and looking for lost car keys, but his story quickly unraveled. The police found disturbing evidence inside his SUV, items that made Sana's skin crawl. First, there was a knife, wrapped in cloth and hidden under the passenger seat. It wasn't an ordinary knife. The blade was worn, and the handle was smooth from years of use. Next to it was a set of duct tape, rope, and zip ties, all stashed in a small canvas bag. Dennis had likely planned something far worse than just following her. The real horror came when they found the photos. Many were of women, all taken from a distance, some in grocery stores, others as they left malls, a few while walking their dogs. And then Sana's breath caught in her throat. Scattered among the pictures were photos of her, some from the toy store that night, and many others taken before. They were taken when she dropped her daughter off at school, when she went grocery shopping, and even when she left her apartment. Realizing Dennis had been following her for days, maybe weeks, made her feel sick. As the investigation continued, more terrifying truths about Dennis emerged. He often stalked women, but none of his victims had ever filed charges. He was disturbingly careful, always skirting the edges of the law, always evading arrest or detection. 2 years earlier, in another town, Dennis had been investigated for the disappearance of a woman, though no evidence was ever found. The case had since gone cold. Sana was horrified to realize she could have easily become another cold case, another missing person, if her husband hadn't arrived in time that night. The police assured her Dennis would be locked up and no longer a threat. Sana and her husband left the police station. They drove home in the quiet darkness. She glanced over at her husband, grateful that he had arrived just in time. But deep down, a new sense of caution had been born. She would never let her guard down like that again. The Clown in the Tree. This happened to me when I was 14. It was the same year everyone was talking about creepy clowns lurking in random places. The stories were everywhere, but I never took them seriously until I had an encounter of my own. I was sitting alone in the living room. My parents had gone to my grandparents' house for the evening, leaving me home by myself. But instead of feeling free, there was a strange unease I couldn't shake. I texted some friends, inviting them over to kill time John and Emma. We played video games for a while, but after a few hours, we got bored. John had an idea. He said, "Let's go into the woods." There was a forest right behind my house that we usually avoided, especially at night. But it was still light out, and with nothing else to do, I agreed. We gathered ourselves and headed out. Part of me regretted it as soon as we left the house. The forest was dense, tall trees casting cool shade, but we weren't scared. We joked around, tossed sticks, and laughed about nothing. We had been there for about 20 or 30 minutes when we heard something strange. Someone was crying. The sound was faint but unmistakable, like sobbing, desperate, coming from deep within the trees. We all stopped, staring at each other. John was the first to break the silence, whispering tensely, "What the hell is that?" None of us knew, and Emma suggested we go check it out. I wanted to say no, but before I could, everyone was already heading towards the sound. My heart started pounding harder with each step. Something felt wrong, like we were walking into a place we shouldn't. As we got closer, we saw a figure slumped on a large branch of an old tree. It was a man, dressed as a clown. His outfit was white with black polka dots, but it was stained and torn. He wore a black wig, but it was messy, and his makeup was smeared by what looked like tears. He just sat there, quietly crying. John, being the idiot he was, yelled, "Hey, you idiot! Why are you crying up there?" A chill ran down my spine, and I instantly turned to John, telling him to shut up. But it was too late. The clown looked down at us, his tear-streaked face twisting into a smile. His lips curled upward, but it was hollow, as if he was trying to express something through invisible pain. And then I saw it. His hand, gripping a large machete, the blade covered in what looked like blood. We were frozen. He just sat there, staring at us, his smile widening grotesquely, yet his eyes were cold, emotionless. He said, "You won't understand, but when I show you, you will." Panic surged through me, and without thinking, I screamed, "Run!" We scattered, running in all directions. My heart pounded, my feet barely touching the ground as I sprinted towards home. The forest seemed endless, branches scratching at my skin as I ran. I could hear the others screaming, their voices fading as we were separated. I reached the edge of the woods, sprinting into my backyard. I didn't stop until I was inside, slamming the door behind me. Then, I waited for my friends. Emma made it back, panting and pale with fear. But John wasn't with us. We waited for him, hoping he'd burst through the door, laughing about how scared we were. But then we waited, and no one came. We called the police. They came and searched the forest. We told them everything: the clown, the machete, the crying. They didn't seem surprised. It turned out the man we saw was a local. He had been on the run for days. The police said he was a heavy drug user who had killed his wife and left her body wrapped in a white sheet. The next day, they found John. He was dead, discovered in a deep lake in the forest. The man must have chased him while the rest of us ran. I couldn't believe it. John was gone, just like that. And it was my fault for agreeing to go into that forest. If I hadn't, maybe he would still be alive. I told my parents everything, and they promised never to leave me home alone again. But it didn't help much. I couldn't sleep for weeks, and when I did, I had nightmares of the clown standing in the forest, smiling at me with his blood-stained machete. It's been 5 years since that night. I'm 19 now, but the memory of what happened in the forest is still burned into my mind. John's disappearance and the discovery of his body in the lake. It haunts me. No one ever talked about it after the police closed the case. A tragic accident, they said. A drug-crazed maniac. But I knew there was more to it. For years, I pushed the memories down, but recently, they've started to resurface. It began with nightmares, the image of the clown, his twisted smile. But lately, it's been more real, as if he's not just in my dreams anymore. Something is coming for me. I've started feeling like I'm being watched again, just like back then. And tonight, I swear I saw him, standing at the edge of the forest behind my house, staring at me. I grabbed a flashlight, pepper spray, and a taser. I don't even know what I was thinking, but I couldn't sit here, paralyzed by fear anymore. The only way to end this is to go back to where it all started. The air was thick with silence as I stepped outside, the flashlight casting weak beams through the trees. The moment I entered the forest, each step felt heavier than the last, as if the woods themselves were pulling me deeper into the darkness. I didn't know where I was going, but my legs seemed to remember the way. Soon enough, I found myself back at the place where we had first seen the clown crying. Suddenly, the rustling of leaves shattered the silence. I froze. The sound of snapping twigs grew closer. I slowly turned around. The flashlight shook in my trembling hands, illuminating a figure perched on a branch, whistling. It was him. He looked just like before, his white clothes smeared with dirt and something darker dried blood. His black wig was still a tangled mess. He just sat there, staring, holding the machete. The clown tilted his head, his smile twisting even more as he jumped down effortlessly, walking slowly, deliberately toward me. He said, "Welcome back." I was so angry I almost cried, yelling that I knew what he had done to John. The clown's smile faded, replaced by a fake look of pity. "You don't understand," he whispered. "I didn't kill him. He chose it." I shook my head, backing away. His words. When I ran, I remembered seeing John hesitate, standing still. He didn't seem scared, more like mesmerized. And what he said before we ran into the woods, he looks sad, doesn't he? I snapped back to reality as the clown got closer, saying that when it was my turn, I'd understand. His words hit me like a punch. I stumbled backward, tripping over a fallen branch. The flashlight slipped from my hand, flickering as it rolled across the ground. Darkness enveloped me, and I reached to grab it, but the clown's footsteps were closer now. I looked up and saw him towering over me, raising the machete. I pulled the pepper spray from my pocket and sprayed it. He staggered for a moment. But then I heard a voice that sounded like John's. "Alex, you need to leave." I don't know how. I didn't look back at the clown. I just ran. His laughter echoed behind me. Suddenly, I was standing in my backyard, alone. The forest was quiet now, the house dark and still. I rushed inside and called the police, convinced he was still out there. When the police arrived this time, he was there. They found him crouched near the lake, clutching the machete. His clothes were soaked in blood and dirt. He didn't resist when they approached. Later, they interrogated him for hours. The clown believed he was chosen to lead people to the other side. The police dismissed it as the ramblings of a madman. But even then, I knew something darker was at play. Underground parking and mysterious people. I worked the night shift at an apartment complex downtown. The job seemed simple enough: monitor cameras, patrol, and ensure the building's security. The building was constructed in the late 60s, and its design left many vulnerable entry points in the parking garage. The association was concerned about security, especially with the occasional break-ins and homeless people finding shelter in the hidden corners of the basement. I had worked here for months, and every night I would check every nook and cranny. Most nights were quiet, normal, even boring. Until tonight. I walked through the dimly lit parking garage, my footsteps echoing. The place was a maze of dead spaces and blind spots. Too many places to hide. Too many areas the cameras couldn't see. My flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing only parked cars and empty spaces. I always hated the door that led to a dead-end hallway. It was an isolated corridor that led nowhere. Just a locked door that couldn't be opened from the inside, as if it held some history better left unknown. As I approached the door, it was wide open. A cold wave of fear washed over me. The door was supposed to be locked tight. I swept my flashlight down the narrow hallway. There was nothing, just an empty glass bottle lying on the ground. My anxiety spiked. The thought of stepping into the hallway made me uneasy. I didn't want to get trapped in there, especially knowing the door locked from the outside. But procedure is procedure. I had to follow it, and I couldn't just leave the bottle there. Reluctantly, I stepped inside. I moved toward the bottle, my flashlight reflecting off the cold gray walls. Each step felt heavier than the last. I bent down, picked up the bottle, and stood up. But then, the sound that chilled me to the bone, the door slammed shut behind me. I rushed to the door, panic rising in my chest, and grabbed the handle. It was locked. I pounded on the metal door, screaming for help, but the thick concrete walls swallowed my cries. My heart raced as I realized no one was coming. It was 3 a.m. and I was trapped. I tried my phone, no signal. The thick walls and metal door blocked everything. I was completely cut off from the outside world. I leaned against the cold wall, trying to calm myself down. The flashlight was my only lifeline in the stifling darkness. I switched it off to save the battery, but I could still hear echoes from somewhere. Then the sound of car alarms blared, one after the other. Whoever had locked me in was out there, doing whatever they wanted, smashing car doors, stealing whatever they could. After what felt like hours, I heard footsteps. It was a miracle. Someone was out there, and I had to make them hear me. I pounded on the door with all my strength, shouting loudly. Finally, a deep, raspy voice answered from the other side, and after a moment, the lock clicked. The door opened, and I felt a wave of relief. A passerby, on their way to work early, had heard my banging. I thanked them profusely as I stumbled out of the hallway, my legs shaking, but my relief didn't last long. As I returned to the basement, chaos greeted me. Windows were shattered, glass littered the concrete floor. At least a dozen cars had been broken into, valuable items stolen. Whoever locked me in knew exactly what they were doing. They had silenced the alarms after each car was hit, leaving behind damage worth tens of thousands of dollars. My heart sank. I knew what was coming next. When the morning shift arrived and the residents discovered the theft, the police would be called, and I would be fired. Security had been breached under my watch, and though it wasn't my fault, I was the one held responsible. Weeks later, after I had quit, the mystery still haunted me. I replayed the events of that night over and over in my head. How did they know exactly where to trap me? How did they avoid the cameras so perfectly? No one was ever caught. The footage showed nothing, just me, doing my rounds. As I walked, I didn't see a thing. Maybe they knew the blind spots of the place too well. Months had passed, but tonight, that phone call pulled me back to the core of everything. I walked into the parking garage. I approached the dead-end hallway, my heart pounding harder with every step. The door was ajar, just like that night. I could feel the weight of the past pressing on me, daring me to confront it. There was something I missed before. I stood at the entrance, staring, then cautiously moved forward as my senses sharpened. This time, I was ready for whatever I might face. No more running. Then I saw him. It was probably the man who trapped me. His gaunt face was pale and dirty, his hollow eyes fixed on me. He stood still, almost like a statue, as if he had been waiting for me all this time. A chill ran down my spine. The man wasn't a ghost or a specter, he was real. My voice trembled as I spoke. "Who are you? Why did you do this?" The man didn't move at first, but then, slowly, a twisted smile spread across his face, growing wider. He started walking toward me. He started saying something I didn't understand, talking about how I would soon see for myself the secret of this place, the truth I had been afraid of and running from. He said he wasn't just some random drifter that night, and that he had been here much longer than I thought. This building, this place, it wasn't just concrete and steel. It was a prison, and people like him, they were trapped inside. For a moment, his expression darkened. He told me that there are things in this world that feed on fear and suffering. And places like this, they are where they hunt. Now, He was part of its cycle. My mind raced as I tried to understand what he was saying. The truth hit me, and I realized this man wasn't just some random criminal. He was a victim of something much darker, something that had taken hold of him and was now trying to take me too. I stepped back, my heart pounding. I'm not like you. I can still get out of this. His smile widened again, sinister and mocking. I turned, glancing at the door, thinking about running. I clenched my fists, took one last look at the man, then turned and sprinted toward the door. I could hear his laughter echoing behind me, filling the narrow hallway. I ran through the parking garage, then stopped. Standing there, in the darkness, was another figure, identical to the man in the hallway. I froze. This couldn't be happening. More figures appeared, stepping out from the shadows. Each one looked just like him, pale, gaunt. Maybe they weren't real, but they felt so real, their malicious energy surrounding me. I staggered. That man hadn't been lying. This place, this building, it was still alive. It had taken him, just as it had taken others before him. And now it was my turn. But I wasn't going to let that happen. With one last surge of strength, I got up and ran, not stopping until I was far away from the building, the figures fading into the night behind me. I didn't look back. Safe in my apartment, I sat in the dark, the truth of that night still sinking in. The man, the building. I had escaped, but deep down I knew it wouldn't be that simple. I needed to stay far away from that place and never go back. Living parasitically in grocery stores. A small, dimly lit grocery store in a quiet neighborhood. Behind the store is a small warehouse. The story revolves around the night shifts, when the store is nearly empty and the silence is only broken by the hum of the refrigerators. Despite Len's diligence, the mystery remains unsolved. The warehouse is thoroughly checked every night, but some items continue to disappear. The store's security cameras show nothing unusual, only adding to the frustration. Len begins to wonder if someone is playing a prank on her, or if something more sinister is going on. One night, during her break, Len goes to the break room, which is quite small and located behind the store. As she sits down to rest, the silence is broken by a faint sound. It's a cough. She stopped, listening carefully. The coughing sound seemed to come from the vent near the ceiling, a small, rusty grate that barely circulated air. Len moved closer to the vent, standing on a chair to look inside. The darkness inside the vent was deep, and at first, she saw nothing at all. She doesn't dare turn on the light, but then something messy, like a tangled mass of hair, appears inside. Her breath catches as she realizes it's moving, accompanied by a faint rustling sound. She quickly steps back. It's not just an animal, it's something more. Over the next few nights, Len became increasingly aware of strange occurrences in the store. Items went missing from the storage room. Odd noises were heard, and now there was the troubling discovery in the vent. One night, as Len is restocking shelves, she sees something that makes her blood run cold. She catches a glimpse of a man, hunched over, his face hidden in the shadows. He's wearing a dirty coat, and something about him seems very strange. As he moves, Len notices something familiar, the store's C-shaped logo on a wrapper in his hand. He quickly stuffs the wrapper into his pocket and heads toward the restroom. A little while later, though it wasn't too late yet, the store became busy with a large group of customers since it was the weekend, so I didn't pay much attention to the restroom anymore. People were still going in and out as usual. Maybe I was just overthinking. Late at night, she mustered all her courage to quietly check the restroom to see if anything was amiss. She looked up at the ceiling and saw a small vent grate, slightly ajar. She wondered if he might have crawled into it. She shuddered as countless questions flooded her mind. Now that she knew the truth, Len decided to continue monitoring the man. hoping to gather enough evidence to present to her manager. She checked the vents every night, listening for the sounds that signaled his movement. The man was very careful, only appearing when the store was crowded, blending into the crowd before slipping into his hiding spot. As the days passed, Len began to notice more signs of his presence. Wrappers stuffed into corners, footprints in the dust near the vent, and once, the faint smell of sweat lingered in the air when it was hot. The next day, Len decided to confront the man. She waited until the store was at its busiest, knowing he would likely emerge from his hiding place. She positioned herself near the back of the store, close to the restroom, and waited. Sure enough, she saw him. He looked disheveled, his clothes tattered, and his eyes darted around nervously as he slipped into the restroom. She bravely and stealthily rushed in. The man was halfway into the vent, his legs dangling from the ceiling. He froze when he saw her, eyes wide with fear. For a moment, they stared at each other, neither moving. Then, he quickly pulled his entire body into the vent. Len reported the incident to her manager, who was initially skeptical but agreed to call the authorities. When the police arrived, they searched the vents and found signs of someone living there. But the man was nowhere to be found. In the following days, the store installed new security measures, including cameras in the warehouse and a more secure ventilation system. If he tried to escape, he would find no way out, and he wouldn't be able to return. In the same neighborhood, the police finally caught him following warnings about vent dwelling. Once again, he had done it and was arrested for his actions. Mysterious masked person. The house was peaceful under the moonlight, and it seemed like it would be a simple summer week without my parents. They trusted me to take care of everything, and so far, I had been enjoying video games, staying up late every kid's dream. Around 11 o'clock p.m., I was lounging on the couch, absorbed in my game. My phone buzzed beside me. A message from an unknown number popped up on the screen. Hi. I frowned. Who was this? I asked, but the reply came instantly, mixed with irritation and aggression. You don't know who this is? I tried explaining that I had just gotten a new phone and lost my contacts, but the angry messages kept coming. I assumed it was a prank and put my phone on silent, returning to my game. I wasn't sure how much time had passed, but I was startled by a sound, a knock on the bedroom window. At first, I thought I was imagining it. It was late, and I'd been alone for days. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. Still, I cautiously moved to the window, pulling the curtain aside. Nothing, just an empty yard. But I knew I'd heard something. I pulled out my phone, intending to call my mom, when I noticed several unread messages from the same unknown number. The last one sent chills down my spine. I'm here. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat louder than the last. I immediately tried to call my mom, but the screen flashed, no signal. No way. We always had good reception here. I ran to the back porch and listened. Maybe, just maybe, someone was crying for help. I had years of self-defense training, and despite the fear surging through me, I was ready to defend myself. This could be a setup, a trick. I grabbed an old baseball bat from the garage and stepped into the backyard. The night was eerily quiet, which made me even more uneasy. I walked toward the edge of the trees, sweeping through the shadows. I shouted into the night, trying to sound confident, demanding who was there and telling them not to mess with me. Suddenly, a flashlight flickered, shining straight at me from deep in the woods. Whoever was holding it was too far for me to see their face, but they were trying to get my attention. The light went out as quickly as it had come on, and the screaming started again, this time more desperate. I slowly made my way toward the spot where the light had appeared. As I got closer to the trees, my heart pounded louder than my footsteps. The woods were dense, with towering trees casting deep shadows. I knew I shouldn't be doing this, but I couldn't stop. I yelled out, asking where the person was. A voice answered from somewhere ahead, a faint whisper saying,
Here, help me.
I stepped deeper into the woods. My grip tightened around the bat, and my legs felt heavy as I moved forward. I saw a figure. My voice trembled as I asked if it was the person calling for help. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it started moving. In a split second, I realized this wasn't someone tied up. This was someone alive, and they were running toward me. Panic surged through me, and something inside screamed at me to get away to save my life. I didn't know how, but I ran. I slammed the porch door behind me, locking it, then sprinted to my room, slamming the door shut. The knocking started again, first at the front door, then at the window. It was relentless, as if he was trying to break in from every corner. He wasn't playing anymore. He was hunting me. I heard the sound of glass shattering from the living room. My heart raced as I realized he was inside. Footsteps echoed through the house, slow and deliberate. He was looking for me. I hid behind the bedroom door, gripping the bat. I held on so tightly my knuckles turned white. The footsteps grew closer. I could hear his breathing just outside my door. The door creaked open, and I saw the wolf mask peeking out. He cautiously stepped inside, unaware that I was right behind him. In that split second, I swung the bat as hard as I could. It slammed into his head. He collapsed to the ground, and I didn't stop. I swung over and over until I was sure he wouldn't get up. The house was now quiet after the chaos. Inside, everything was still. The intruder in the wolf mask lay motionless on the floor, while I stood over him, panting, hands shaking as I gripped the bloodied bat. I stared down at the man, his body sprawled across the floor. The wolf mask, now cracked, still covered his head, hiding his face. For a moment, I froze, unable to process what I had just done. My phone still had no signal, but I needed help. I needed to get out of there. I rushed to the landline in the kitchen, my hands trembling uncontrollably as I dialed 911. I struggled to find the words, pressing the phone tightly to my ear, trying to calm down. I glanced back at the hallway leading to my bedroom, terrified that the masked man would get up again. The distant sound of sirens broke the silence of the night. Red and blue lights flickered across the walls as the police car stopped in front of the house. Their grim faces approached the door as I shakily opened it. The officers stepped inside, examining the broken glass, the signs of a struggle, and finally, the man lying on the floor. One officer knelt down, checking for a pulse. He said, "You did the right thing," as if he had seen this horror many times before. They told me to sit down and breathe, but I couldn't focus on anything except that mask, the wolf mask. Why? Why did he choose to wear it? The unconscious man was lifted onto a stretcher. His mask still hadn't been removed. My mind was still reeling from the events that had just unfolded. The next morning, I was at the police station. The officers asked me about the man, whether I had ever seen him before. I shook my head, explaining the messages, the strange knocks, and the wolf mask. Then, they told me his name was Thomas, and he had been on the run for years. A detective handed me a file filled with old newspaper clippings and photographs. The story they told me was chilling. Thomas had a disturbing past. Years ago, he had committed a series of home invasions in nearby towns. He would stalk his victims for days, learning their routines before making his move, and he always wore a mask to cover half his face. But it wasn't just any mask. The wolf mask had become his signature. In every report, survivors described the same thing. A tall man in a wolf mask, terrorizing families, always escaping before the police could catch him. until now. The final piece of the mystery was revealed when the detective, now more familiar with Thomas's case, explained why he chose the wolf mask. The detective slid a newspaper article toward me. It had a blurry photo of the wolf mask next to a headline that read, "Wolf Stalker Evades Capture." The detective said the wolf represented a predator, a cunning hunter. Thomas saw himself as the wolf, and his victims were the prey. It terrified me to think about how long he might have been watching me, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He had been toying with me, like a wolf plays with its prey. That night, back home, I sat alone in the living room, the faint hum of the TV filling the silence. My parents wouldn't be leaving me alone for a long time after this. The mystery of why he wore the mask had been solved, but the fear of that night still lingered. I didn't know if I would ever feel truly safe again, but one thing I did know, I would never forget the image of that cracked wolf mask lying on the floor.